here?
I am here.
Here.
I am actually here, even though you can't hear me on the video. Mark Bowden. And we have Mr. Finnegan is with us, and Ms. Garrett is with us. And to my right is Nikki Laws, who's our communications specialist for the district. Last week at the curriculum committee meeting, we were given some of the statistics, which I think presented in more detail what a challenge we have as a district teaching our minority students, particularly our Hispanic students. I think everybody could see that we could do better. Ann and Ethan and I met with Dr. Blakey and Dr. Barber last year, and we talked about this and discussed some of the long-term and short-term things that we can do to begin to address this. And we came up with 4 things that the district could do immediately to begin to address this problem. The heart of the problem is probably very complex, but clearly I think it's a reasonable assumption that language barrier plays a big role in the lagging performance of a lot of our Hispanic students. So one of the 4 things that we decided that we could initiate right away was what we call communications, hence it falls before this committee, which was to develop a consistency of translation and interpretation across the district that ensures equal access to information and opportunity for all of our students and their families. So tonight, Vicki is going to tell us about Talking Points, which is an interpretation system that we've already had in place on a limited basis, but we are expanding it with a grant. And so I wanted to hear more about how that works, how it's used, what its status is currently, if it's a temporary fix, if there's a way we can make it permanent, if we decide we want to go that way. So that's the plan. And we have a few other things in store. The new website is still under development. So with that, Nikki, do you want to tell us a bit about what's going on with Talking Points?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So to kick things off, I think it is always really useful for us to be reminded of our board's goal statement and our mission, vision, and core values here as a district. And we'll circle back around to this at the end of the presentation, but I think Talking Points and our district's pilot of the district-wide license of Talking Points fits squarely into our mission, vision, and core values, and particularly into our strategic plan in some really incredible ways. So again, our board goal statement is, which I am no longer on. Oh, if I could figure out how to word this. KCSD's strength is its bilingual and multicultural community. In alignment with the district's vision and mission, the board charges our administration to build on that strength with an educational system that enables all of our students to succeed, no matter their origin or their primary language. And our vision and mission, you'll see again go hand in hand. Our vision is that the Kennett Consolidated School District is an inclusive community that nurtures, prepares, and empowers all, showing everyone they matter in their journey to succeed in the world. And we'll skip right forward. And again, these core values of being integrity, resilience, student-centered, accountability, and collaboration. So I know we're trying to begin all of our meetings from that place. So just a reminder for everyone. And I'm actually hoping that we can kick things off with a video.
This country is changing. Right now, 1 in 4 children are born to parents who are not born in the US. And that is projected to grow to 30 million children by 2030. We think our Talking Points is just the beginning. Talking Points is an education nonprofit, and our mission is to unlock the potential of low-income, diverse parents in the US.
Our name comes from the fact that we want to increase the number of talking points between schools, teachers, and parents so that parents can have more talking points and richer talking points with their children.
we're able to help every parent connect with the school communities in their own languages through two-way translation.
My husband is Spanish speaker from Mexico. It was really hard on me until we had these text messages that came through in Spanish. So that made it like I got to breathe. It makes it much easier because it gives my husband the opportunity to be involved.
When you have 31 kids in your class, making 31 phone calls every single day for 180 days of the school year is literally impossible. It's incredibly easy to text to parents and give them quick updates. It's huge. It's a complete game changer.
We're really excited to be addressing the opportunity gap in creating that change and making sure that the future of this country is inclusive and diverse, and all the students that we're supporting can be successful to be that future of America.
So that was just a brief introduction to talking points that I thought was really helpful. And let's see, and none of this is what I want to do.
We have more time tonight. So.
Well, thank goodness for that. All right. So yes, that's Talking Points' brief introduction to their platform. But really, to reiterate, Talking Points is a digital platform that allows our teachers to communicate across language barriers with their families through what's called two-way education-specific translation. And I want to point out here that Talking Points is the only platform of its kind in the field right now that has translation that's supported both by AI and by humans. And those of us who work in translation, right, who translate documents all the time know that AI is a really great way to get started, but it's often not 100% accurate. And a lot of times things can get lost in translation through AI translated documents. So it's really great to have that human level that's added as well, and is really a game changer in terms of making Talking Points stand out. So who's using it now? So as Mr. Bowden shared, during the COVID-19 pandemic, many of our teachers began using the free teacher license. So they make a license available to any teacher in the United States who would like to use it. Then those teachers can communicate home with their classroom families. Those who have used Talking Points have found it invaluable. So it's the one platform I will say I have heard every single teacher in the district who currently utilizes it just rave. And I do have Marie Lawson here, and I know we were expecting one more communications champion, but I was hoping that they could come join us at the table for a second and share their own experience, kind of from a teacher's perspective on how Talking Points has changed communication with their families. Would you like to come on up?
Join the beat.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming. So this is Marie.
This is Marie Lawson.
Marie Lawson. Well, how nice to meet you.
Thank you. I'm a teacher here at the K Center, and we started using Talking Points during our COVID shutdown. And very quickly, after we started that, we realized that it was one of the best things that came out of the pandemic was our ability to speak with our parents daily, if not more than one time. Before, it used to be before after school and phone calls if we could get a hold of parents because of work schedules, things like that. Talking Points has given us the ability to speak with our parents and almost in an instant fashion. If something comes up at home, they can text us, and then we can also text right back. We have it, the ability to use it on our phones or on the computer. And so parents, we are right at their fingertips as well. So if they need, if their student forgot their lunchbox, for instance, I had that this morning. Mom texted me and said, "I'll be right back. He forgot his lunchbox. I want to go get it." So I knew at lunchtime his lunchbox was there. And for a 5-year-old, that's a really big deal, right? You don't have your lunchbox.
A big deal for me.
Yeah. So we're able to really solve a lot of problems through Talking Points. And one of them being the language barrier. I'm the only teacher left at Mary D who speaks Spanish. So it gives our teachers a great way to speak with all of the parents in their classroom. And it's not just Spanish. There's 140 some languages. And that's one of the things that drew us to it right away during the COVID pandemic is one of our educators found talking points, and then we all started getting on it because we wanted contact with our kids, right? We left on March 13th and that was it. So we were finding any way that we could to stay in contact with our littles. And so we all got on talking points, and now it's been here to stay ever since. And it's been just a great way for us to communicate and stay in contact with our parents all year long.
So, Marie, how did you go about communicating with parents before you started using talking points?
Phone calls or email, if they had email. And then that was a bit cumbersome because we would try to find emails that work, and phone numbers often change. And then, contacting the school is the last thing you think of when you have a change in your phone number. So we would have to look for numbers or call emergency numbers, and now we have access to talking points. So if a number changes, they definitely call the school now, because we send home advertisements as a communications champion, I make advertisements for every event that we have in the district, every event that's here in the school. So all the teachers are sending home the same information. And if your number's not correct, or if another parent knows, you definitely call the school right away and get things changed so that you have all the information.
And go ahead. This is just a digital, just for texts and emails, or do you have a translator that you can access if you have a teacher who doesn't speak Spanish who needs to speak to parents at home?
Well, the program itself actually translates for us. So when we go in at the current platform that we use, we have to input all the information. So in August, I get my class list, and then I sit there at night and I put every kid's name in, their relationship to their family, whose phone number it is, and things like that. And then I can also choose from a long list of languages that parents may or may not speak. So this year we have a few different languages that were actually on talking points that made it for educators to speak with their families that aren't just Spanish speaking. Mm-hmm. So we do all of that right now, all of the input of that information. And then I got to actually see the presentation as a communications champion with Ms. Laws last week. And now we will have access to a human that could actually do some translating for us if need be. But in the current free version, it's just us using the phone and relying on the translation through the text service. Sorry, that was a long answer.
Yeah, but so prior to having talking points available, mm-hmm. and having a human interpreter, which is fairly recent,
right?
How did teachers who don't speak Spanish or Guatemalan, communicate with families of students if something came up? How did you do it?
We had a paper, and on the top it said Spanish-speaking phone calls. So then you had to write down who you were, the message that you needed translated to the family, the phone number, and who they would be calling, or that went to the front office staff. And then when we have Ms. Carmen Aja, we also can email her, and she will contact families for us. So we still have both of those ways of communication. So now we have 3, but we mostly rely on talking points.
And I think what you're hearing Marie share is exactly what the teacher shared who was in that last video, right? Where he said to make 31 phone calls every day or once a week or once a month was incredibly arduous, right? And wasn't necessarily an efficient nor effective use of our teachers' time or our families' time ultimately. And so really what you see with talking points is that across languages, right? No matter what language our families are speaking, that communication has become more efficient and effective for our teachers in terms of a workflow, but also then, you have that real-time access. No one parent wants to be connected to just one individual in the district, right? As much as we love who that one individual is, and we do, Carmen is an incredible asset to our district and to our school communities. But, really, we want all of our families to have access to every single staff member in the district, and Talking Points really has allowed our teachers to get up off of the ground in doing that, and this district-wide license will take us to the next level in ways that, that Marie has shared.
And one of the things, too, that I really love about this and teaching the littles in our district is I can send pictures to families. I can share their day. We can on the weekends, I get talking points all weekend long. They're sending me, I got one yesterday. One of my students was working on mass seeds and bees popped up. Well, bees my classroom are bees. And so the mom said that she wanted to share this picture with me. So I feel more closely connected to my families more than I have in the past. And that was pretty close. I mean, Mary D has always been a special place. But with talking points, we're really interacting in a much more personal level, sharing our lives basically for 182 days.
You said, Marie, that you're the one teacher who does speak Spanish.
Right.
What about teachers who didn't speak Spanish at all? Were they having that kind of interaction with the families of their students in the past?
No, and I can't even say that we were prior to talking points, because we still would have to rely on phone or email. So it wasn't as though we were sharing photos very often or communicating as quickly as we are now. The Talking Points app is literally at your fingertips, just like the kids, the apps that they play on their phones. It's very easy to use, and it's very accessible to everyone.
So functionally, you use the app and you select email or text and you select the student?
We're gonna cover exactly what that looks like. But yes, kind of.
Never mind. I look forward to
We'll cover exactly how the app works, because it will, so that will look the same for our families regardless of whether our teachers are using the free option or the district-wide license. Yes. Marie, anything else you want to add in terms of your experience with Talking Points?
I had a couple of
go
things.
ahead.
So I had a great experience last year being at an open house and speaking with the kindergarten team about why it was that so many families had come to that open house. And I wonder what relationship between Talking Points and that sort of significantly more families and particularly Latino families coming. Do you see a connection there? And what are the other things that are like that? What are the other things that are contributing to our families feeling like they that they should show up when perhaps they haven't in the past?
I think that Talking Points, like I said earlier, with the connectivity to us as educators, today, for instance, we have conferences, and today is the day that we have the night conferences. So those are generally busier schedules than most. And I think that having the ability, this morning I sent out, hey, here's the link for today's conferences. If you are not able to be here virtually or in person, here's your link. You can get on that way. So I think having multiple ways to communicate with each other, and also to advertise what's going on in the schools. Yes, we send home paper flyers, but they're 5 and 6 years old, and they use folders, and sometimes the papers, they stay in the bottom of the book bag, which is where that group came from. Yeah. So I think that having the Talking Points app and all of the teachers sending out messaging, not at the same time, but in the same way. We're using consistent messaging. I create things and send it to all the teachers. So we're all sending the same things. And I think that it's just encouraged more participation because parents are aware. They're able to communicate. They're able to ask questions. Some people might not have come before. Can I bring my child is a huge question. And so when you can just send that question right back, and yes, absolutely, that encourages participation as well.
And I think it's important to note here too that teachers have clout that our school administrators and our district administrators don't necessarily have, right? You have relationships with our families at a one-on-one level that I think make an invitation to an event feel much more special and much more relevant to children. And so adding this really fills the gap. This app fills the gap of that teacher to family level of communication. So we will always continue to do the district-wide communication that we have been talking about and will continue to talk about, right? That we'll have that comprehensive communication system in place, but this is a core part of that system, and we'll talk a little bit more about that because it fills that gap. We know that our teachers are incredible influencers when it comes to our families, and we want to be able to leverage that and allow them to talk to families about their child's educational experience, but also additional opportunities that they should be leveraging and help kind of take advantage of that trust.
That's fantastic. Speak to consistency, if you would. So you've said that several times. What is the virtue of the message being consistent across the school?
The one thing that I love about the communications champion position, I was doing this prior to it having a name, but at the same time now it's more organized. And with Ms. Law sending out promotional packages and things like that to me, then I send it out to my colleagues. And so we're all sending the same flyer or the same advertisement that Ms. Law has created or that I have created. So the messaging now is more consistent rather than 4 teachers sending something home saying, hey, this is what we're doing. Maybe some other teachers did not send it home. So now it's more consistent in what Ms. Reynolds, when she asked us to send home something through Talking Points, I send it to all 13 teachers. All 13 teachers send it home after I send it to them. So it's consistent in that way as well.
That's terrific. So, and we deeply appreciate it. I deeply appreciate the work you all have done. And I do want to make the point to Ms. Laws's point that there's clout with the teachers. This also is an app, correct me if I'm wrong, that came out of the kindergarten center and has been then passed sort of through the district and now is being supported by the administration, and certainly I'm in support of it. And I think that's an important thing to say as well, that the collaboration between educators, all of the educators in the kindergarten center is very strong, and sort of you can feel it as you walk through the halls here. And that idea that that group comes up with a solution to something and passes it, up into the rest of the district, and that our job is to find those things and support them. I think this is a good example of that, and so I bring that to everyone's attention. And thank you so much for being here. It's great to see you.
And I just wanted to quickly introduce our new addition to the table, who's Megan Mabray. She is an ELD teacher at the middle school and represents a really incredible voice, both as an ELD teacher at this table, but also as a secondary teacher. So we're going to talk a little bit about Talking Points at the secondary level and how we're hoping to unlock access to our secondary teachers, but she's got some incredible experience to share with Talking Points as well.
A quick question before that. I'll defer my question on how real-time the conversation is till after the demo.
Yeah.
But you had mentioned 140 languages. Is that what Kennett has or what Talking Points handles?
That's what Talking Points handles.
Right. How many different languages do we have at Kennett right now?
It's a good question. It's closer to, I would say, probably a dozen, and I could get you that specific
Okay, but it's
list.
not 140.
Oh,
okay.
no,
Okay.
no. But it may be. Megan, is there anything you would like to share about your experience with Talking Points and how it's helped you since the onset of the pandemic?
Sure. So as Ms. Law said, I'm an ELD teacher at the middle school, and before Talking Points, I would say a lot of teachers went through me to communicate to families. So they would be like, oh, Megan, can you tell this family this or this family this? But since Talking Points, they don't have to do that, and they've just been communicating directly with the families themselves. So if it's something that's just specific to science or social studies or math, they do not need to go through me, and they're able to communicate with the families. Also, it's such a great tool because a lot of my families do have email addresses, but they don't necessarily know how to work them, or they don't check their email, but they all have phones and they all text, and almost all of them are comfortable with texting. So the parent response since Talking Points has been so great. If we call and leave a message, they always won't call back, but I haven't heard of a teacher reaching out and a parent not replying on Talking Points. So it's just been a really great tool for all of the teachers to connect to the students in the English language development program, as well as the students that come from Spanish-speaking families or Portuguese-speaking families.
So when did it change, Megan? When did you begin to use this?
So the middle school started using it like during the pandemic. That's when I found out about it, and that's when a lot of other teachers found out about it. So when we were strictly like virtual.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And are a lot of teachers at the middle school using it?
I don't know the exact number, honestly, but I would say a decent amount.
And I will say too, you have two groups. It's not your ILT, it's your other group that operates in the building has recently reached out, to specifically ask if we are adopting the district-wide license of this platform, because they have identified some of the barriers that we're going to talk about during the presentation and would love to expand access within the middle school. So I would say even those who aren't using it, my sense, but Megan, jump in here, is that even those who aren't using it would like to be using it, and they're just waiting for that district-wide support to make that happen. So I think there's a general awareness, regardless of whether or not our teachers are utilizing the platform or they aren't at this point, that it is a value added in terms of.
So do you get to have longer lunches now, Megan, that you're not doing this for everybody?
I mean, I'm still using my time in other ways. Yeah. I will say also, I was talking to a teacher today that is the baseball coach, and he was like asking me, I coach lacrosse, he was asking me what app we use, and I was telling him that hopefully for next year he'll be able to use Talking Points with his baseball like players, and he was excited about that because it can be like tedious sometimes, like downloading another app and like communicating it. So it'd be really great when it's all like streamlined.
Excellent, thanks.
Anything else you ladies would like to add? No? Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for being
Stay
here.
with us
Yes.
unless you have to.
Yeah. All right. So as you heard Marie and Megan share, those who have used Talking Points really have found it invaluable. So the experiences that they've shared today are much like the experiences that I've heard from just about every other teacher in the district who's already using Talking Points. And again, those who don't use Talking Points would really like to, but they've been limited by that free teacher license, and we're going to talk a little bit about why. And as a district, we've never really been able to provide district-wide support, official support to our users, right? So those who have always had questions or may have seen a limitation in the system, a bug in the system, we haven't been able to jump in and support in the way that we would like to because teachers are signing up on their own volition, and we don't have any kind of oversight or ability to jump in from an admin perspective and see what might be going on in the back end. So those are both items that I think quickly we realized were needs, and they were the impetus for us exploring a paid school and district license as a pilot. So that's the next step. So how do they use it now? I think we heard Megan and Marie talk a little bit about this. So teachers on their free teacher license are signing up, again, on their own volition. They're logging in, and they can log in via desktop or mobile. So there's a mobile app, and then there is a website that's available via browser that anyone can log into. And our teachers then, again, you heard them talk a little bit about this, they manually upload their students. In the free license, there's a limit of 250 students. So you can imagine that both that student limit and the manual uploading tends to be the limiting factor for our secondary teachers because some of them teach more than that 250 students. And in addition to that, could you imagine the time it would take to manually roster 250 kids across all of your classes, right? At that point, it just becomes cumbersome. In addition to that, they would have to build class and group rosters. So once the students are there, they have to be organized, right, by group. And those in the free version are limited to 5. So it's a really helpful tool, but again, at that secondary level, when you might be teaching more than 5 classes, you're already limited there. Teachers then can message individuals, groups, or classes. So they can do that one-on-one family communication that you heard Ms. Lawson say was so valuable. But then you can also reach out to an entire class or an entire group, like a sport, a team, all at once. Those are called announcements. Families then receive and respond to those messages in their native language. So teachers reach out in English and the family receives the message in their native language and can respond in their native language. And what the teacher sees on the opposite end as a response comes back in English, right? So that's the beauty of that two-way translation is that everyone can speak in the language that they're most comfortable speaking in. And our families can operate via SMS. So you heard Ms. Mabry talk about text messages and how valuable those are. But then there's also a mobile app that our families can access, and that has talk to text, which is great for, we know we have a small number of families who aren't yet literate. And for those families who aren't able to type, they are able to talk to text and then send that message. And of course, those who prefer working on a computer and sending a message maybe during the workday, right? They can do that via desktop as well. So really, you're finding all kinds of access points, which helps to create that equity that we're looking for. Messages can include polls, pictures, videos, files, all of those things. And then messages are archived by individuals, groups, and classes as well. And the district-wide version we're going to talk a little bit about has an extra layer of archive that I think we're going to be really interested in. So again, kind of talking about the free teacher license to district-wide license kind of benefits. So you heard us talk a little bit about this earlier. In the free teacher license, there is translation that is really kind of run by AI. With the district-wide license that we're going to be piloting, there's priority enhanced translation, which adds that a human element, right? So if the AI translated text going back and forth isn't making sense, right? Both ends, the teacher and the family, will have the opportunity to say, hey, this is not looking right, I can't understand this. And that will go to a human translator who will take a look and make sure that the translation is accurate. It's huge for our families who, again, sometimes things just get lost in translation. Again, in the free license, you have that limit of 200 students. And in the unlimited, in the district license, there is an unlimited number of students for each teacher. So again, we're removing that barrier. 5 classes in the free license, unlimited classes in the district license. So again, we're removing that barrier that we know exists, especially for our secondary teachers. More than 100 languages, that does not change. And this is going to be huge for our teachers in the audience. They will no longer have to manually roster. They will be integrated with the SIS, so Talking Points talks to our student information system via Clever. And we are able to pass information along to Talking Points so that our teachers can log in using their district account and automatically see their classes at any given time and just use the tool, right? So I see you guys shaking your head in the back. I'm hoping you're thinking, oh, thank God. So that will be a huge benefit. And it's a huge benefit to the district as well in terms of legal liability. So it helps us make sure that we are communicating with only the parents and guardians who are registered in our system, right, who have educational rights. And in addition to that, it helps to make sure that we have one streamlined process for contact information so that a teacher doesn't have a different cell phone number for mom and dad that the school does or the nurse does, so that if there is an emergency situation, we know that we can all rely on up-to-date contact information at any given time. So huge benefit there. And again, there is that individual and group messaging feature in the free teacher license, but in addition to that, in the district license, there is school and district wide messaging capabilities that admins would have as well. So we may not include that in the initial pilot, but we should definitely recognize that that is a value added. And again, a lot of the other basics of the system operate the same. The one other thing that I want to make sure I point out is that there are enhanced analytics. So for those of us on the back end that act as admins, we're able to jump in at any time and not only see how many conversations are happening and in what nature, but we're also able to jump in and support, again, from a legal perspective. So if we are talking to a teacher and find that they're concerned about the nature of a conversation, right, or how a conversation has gone, or, God forbid, there's a right to know request, right, all of these things become easier for us to dig deeper into with access to the back end of that system. So there's extra protection and an extra layer of support that's built in for our teachers and for the district as well. Does anyone have any questions about the value added of the district-wide license?
So sorry, the district license, it does the surveys, because I don't see that on.
It sure does, and
It's not on
you're
the
right. I didn't add it. Thank you for catching that.
I didn't know
Yes.
if it was part of another group or not.
Nope, absolutely. So individual, group, and class messaging, you add the school and district messaging, and yes, absolutely, that poll feature is accessible, and I'm already thinking about all the ways that we might want to poll members of our community using Talking Points. Yes, it's a great question. Any other questions?
So, interestingly, you could use this app English to English, could you?
Absolutely.
So what that would do is potentially under this circumstance, you could send the same message and magically, it all seems like, being 53, it all seems like the stuff that we were never going to get, phones that talk to each other with, but so conceivably that does provide another level of consistency to be able to do this, to send messages in that mode as well. Is that right?
Absolutely, right. And in that case, you can be sure that the experience that our English-speaking families are having with their teacher, right? And ultimately, if we get to that place of using Talking Points as a school-wide or district-wide platform for communication, that we can ensure that that experience is equitable regardless of the home language of the family, which I think is huge, right? Making sure that no matter which family we're talking to, that they've had the exact same experience with us and that they've had the same access to a whole host of staff members or individuals who can act as experts and support and guide them. When we think about the data, right, that we saw at the curriculum committee meeting,
Right.
I think that that's a huge value added. All right. So what are our next steps? So if you're sold, our next steps are, we've already completed an onboarding meeting with our rep at Talking Points. So one of the really exciting things is that I've been able to work with Dan, Mr. McGuire in the back, and Dr. Collins, and we've spoken with the Talking Points team and would really love to get a taste of what this district-wide license looks like instead of just jumping in. And so they have offered us a free pilot. So when we talk about pilot, we mean free of cost to the district in every way, shape, and form from April until the end of the academic year. So we've had our onboarding meeting with Talking Points, and our tech team is already hard at work with data integration. So making sure, again, that we can utilize Clever to connect our SIS, our Student Information System, Skyward, with Talking Points to make sure that that data is there for our teachers. We are also getting ready to reach out to teachers to ask them if they'd like to be a part of the pilot. So we recognize that it's the end of the academic year, that there's a few months left, and we don't want anyone to feel like this is kind of the straw that's breaking the camel's back, right? So we want to allow everyone, did I get that metaphor right this time? I'm looking at Megan because she saw me last week get it very wrong. No, but we want to make sure that those who want to engage in the pilot have the opportunity to, and those that would prefer to wait and see how the pilot goes and engage next year can do that as well. So we're going to be asking teachers to opt in. Those teachers will receive training. So myself and our Talking Points rep will be training our communications champions. So Ms. Mabray, Ms. Lawson are both communications champions. We have one at almost every building. And they will deliver the training to their fellow teaching staff with support from myself and others. So that will happen in very early April. And then we're looking to launch in April as well so that our teachers have the opportunity to really play with this district-wide license from April until June. In June, we're going to come back to those who participated in the pilot, and we're going to look in the analytics dashboard in the back end, and we're going to really assess how the pilot went, right? What were the positives? What were the negatives? And do we want to move forward with officially implementing a district-wide license? At that point, we do have to follow our our standard operating procedures because this does fall above the annual cost. We can't just go ahead and purchase it. So as a team, we'll be looking at, other software that is out there that operates in a similar manner. I do know that School Messenger is coming out with something over the summer that we think might be semi-comparable, and then taking a look at those options, doing our due diligence, and then hopefully looking to purchase something that we will officially implement over the summer. And I'm really proud to say that Mr. Tracy has been kind enough to work with us. This is a part of our balanced scorecard, so it hits the item of making sure that we have a comprehensive communication system, right, that we're building that out, but also helps on the item of making sure that we have the language services that we need to support, our interpretation, messaging, translation supports. So as a part of Balanced Scorecard, we do have the funding accessible to purchase this for next year.
And how much will it cost, roughly?
Roughly, the numbers that we've looked at most recently have been about $17,000 a year. So it's not an inexpensive software, but in terms of thinking about the value that you've heard about today, I think it's worth every penny.
Yeah, it would seem to be essential for a district when you have this many languages being spoken.
Yes, absolutely. And I double checked, Mr. Finnegan, it's 10. And if you want the specific list, I can get that for you. Not 140, you are correct. Any questions about next steps?
A question somewhere around, I don't know, sign-ups, training.
Yes.
Is there going to be any time you're going to have the current users at Mary D. Lang speak to the other teachers to get a peer-to-peer buy-in instead of a top-down buy-in?
Absolutely, and that's exactly why our communications champions are leading the training. So I plan to be in the room as often as I can to support that training. I know Mr. McGuire will make himself available, Dr. Collins as well, and that we'll be there as a support for our teachers, our communications champions, as they're leading that training. But that's exactly why we want them in that position of being up front. So Marie is a perfect example. She's here at the K Center. She's the school's communications champion, and she will be delivering that training. Same thing with Ms. Mabray. She is a user of Talking Points, an early adopter, and again is our communications champion in that building, a teacher, and will be delivering that training. So across the buildings, there will be, yes, a teacher who is up front. Because really, I think Mr. Kramer made this point earlier, that this is a perfect example of how, as a district, when we find a resource that works for us, that we know is invaluable, that the district can support and augment and make that resource available to all of our teachers. And that's really the goal here.
Yeah, a lot of things that we roll out, I always question about, you have to get buy-in, there's going to be a waste of money. I know, being a director of a software company, you can't tell, a lab person, no, we bought this, you're going to use it. It's not going to happen.
Well, and lucky for us, it's actually the opposite in this case, that our teachers are telling us we need this, right? And they've been telling us for a long time that we should explore this district-wide license. And I think that's part of the benefit and the value here, is that we're providing them the tool that they know they need. Would you guys say that that's an accurate?
Yeah, I know we wish that use it, I'm just not aware of it, and same thing, I know other teachers wish that it was a school initiative, preference.
For those on the PA, the comment was that teachers wish more people did use it and that it was more accessible, if I got that close to right. So I'm excited to hear you say that teachers want to use it.
Yes.
I recognize the challenges that Mr. Finnegan just mentioned as far as adoption. The two don't meet in the same place, right? This is obviously a no-brainer. The cost is very minimal compared to the value that this can deliver. I envision that over time, this will become the district's messaging platform, and that all messages can be farmed out right at the same time in different languages. And I think that's a huge add. The challenge, challenging you and the district team, is drive adoption, right? We know that certain segments of our district community don't like to adopt new things. And we're going to help you. We're behind you every step of the way. We support this, and we want to see it adopted 100%. The other minor point I'd like to make is that I know as you and Mr. McGuire go through the contractual process, if we're sharing data with Talking Points, there's some data privacy issues, and please make sure that our data is protected according to district policy.
Absolutely. And Mr. McGuire always takes a look at these contracts for me when they come through for exactly that explicit reason. And he's really great at making sure that we are complying with those laws as needed. So absolutely. And I think that's another value to your earlier point. It's another value added of doing this pilot, is that we hopefully get more teachers in the door who get a taste of how good Talking Points can be for them and for their students and for their families. And hopefully we create, triple the ambassadors that we currently have for Talking Points, and we just keep growing that core group of users who are really only saying positive things, so that we can start to turn and convert those who may not be early adopters, and that's okay. But we'll be keeping a close eye on the data. That's a value of having this district-wide license, is that we can see who is and who's not using. We can identify trends, and then we can address those trends as needed, so that we ultimately get to 100%. That's the idea. Thank you.
I think there are another couple of things. Doesn't seem like I think there's obviously a thought here that this is worth pursuing. But I think one of the points that I have heard was referenced is that often those individuals who do speak Spanish are called in with frequency, which can be quite disruptive, and also can kind of can make it seem like, everybody's going through, not just Carmen, but whoever happens to speak Spanish. And so I think there's a really valuable piece to this, which I think will help with adoption. The other point I'd make is I do, I'm in kind of daily correspondence with a bunch of people who speak mainly Spanish, and it is texting that works. It's pretty funny because my texting in Spanish is often pretty off, and other folks texting in English is pretty off, and so we can get some pretty hilarious misunderstandings. And I'll mention that I had a misunderstanding. I was working in an after-school program, and a parent was convinced that I had said that her kindergartner was not intelligent, and that was not what I had said, but the text actually was helpful because I passed it on to somebody who spoke much better Spanish than I, and she ran over there and said, no, this is what he was trying to say. So there's a real advantage to being able to track, especially if there's a misunderstanding, if there's something like that. So I think there's a lot to be said for this, and it certainly matches my experience that this is the kind of thing where adoption is easier when it's clear, for example, that the community that you're trying to reach has already adopted this version of how to communicate. And it obviously using very up-to-date technology to solve a problem that I think everybody who has worked in the Latina community, who speaks English primarily, has dealt with for decades, and certainly in this community and elsewhere. I think this is really a remarkable opportunity. I want to thank the teachers for being the champions for this. When we say communications champions, that also means championing to communicate with the administration and school board to say, here's what we need. That's two-way communication at its best. Thanks.
Okay, we took things kind of out of order. Are we finished with talking points for the moment?
We sure are. And this last slide really gets back to exactly the why we're here, right? So I promised I would make it back there. And so as the last slide to talk about talking points, again, just a reminder for our community, for us at the table, right? It's always good to see these stats that 15% of our students are emergent bilinguals, right? That 44% of our students identify as Hispanic. Many of these families do not speak English as their native language. For most it's Spanish, but it's also a whole host of South American indigenous languages. And we have made a commitment. Our vision, our mission says all students, right? And that includes those students who have families who speak different languages. And so I think this is an incredible way to make sure that there's equity and access to communication, and to hopefully get at some of these gaps that we know exist and have contributed to the data that we saw at our last meeting. So I wanted to make sure that we brought it all back there.
Well, thanks, Nikki.
Quick clarification, what is emergent bilingual? What is that?
So emergent bilingual is another way for us to talk about English language development or English language learners.
Thank you.
But I use it, and I think many use it because it really comes from a place of power, right? That these aren't just English language learners, that they are emergent bilinguals, that they will speak multiple languages.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, Nikki. And so I guess you're the sole performer on these next two, but you were going to update us on the website redevelopment.
And I will keep that short and sweet and to the point, I promise.
Okay.
So the website development, you can see here, I've included a screenshot of our brand new homepage so that you can get a taste of what that will look like. This is the landing page for the district. Really visual, reorganized to reflect the experience of our target stakeholders. So you'll see that our navigation is really, besides that about navigation item, is really driven by where you sit in our community, right? So we have information available and accessible for students and families, information readily accessible for staff, for alumni, for members of our community, and the news and events that everyone might want to take advantage of. So really trying to increase, to make better that user experience that we know is so important on a website. So that's our new homepage. And here is an example of an interior page, just so that you, again, have a sense of what the layout looks like, making sure that the navigation is clearly visible along the top of the page and also along the left third of the page as well, so that, again, as a user, you know where you sit in our website at any given time. It's huge for user experience. Again, a really highly visual experience, and making sure that all of our content is 100% up to date. Which brings me to kind of where we are in our progress. So I am working with our district and our school teams. We're about 80% content completion on the district site, and anywhere between 30 and 80% on our school sites, although I think that number has even improved today in talking with one of our principals. So we're getting really close to content completion, but we are taking that slowly, steadily, and being really intentional about the content, because we want to make sure that if we're driving families to our website, if this is the premier place where our families and other stakeholders are going for information, that what they find there is of value to them. So we're about finished with that. And then we'll really begin building out the rest of the pages in the system and looking forward to launching this spring. So that's the update with the website. Does anyone have any questions?
Tying it into our last conversation, Nikki, I see you have Spanish up there, I guess, for a full web translation.
Yes.
Will there be any other languages?
So we can expand to additional languages. One of the benefits of going with Finalsite when we went with them was that they have this built-in feature called WeGlot. And WeGlot is actually a little bit different than an automatic translator, right? We know that Google translates websites all the time, but it's driven by AI and AI only. With WeGlot, we can actually jump into the back end of the translation, and if we find something's not exactly right, we can make it exactly right, which is incredible. And we can do that across languages. Right now, we just have the Spanish accessible because we know that that's the language that the vast majority of our families are looking for. But there's no reason to say that we couldn't expand that based upon the experience of our community. Absolutely.
Yeah, I just don't know what our third most prominent language is, so.
I could tell you. Hang tight.
I just wanted to say thank you to everybody who's working on this. This is a huge, huge, huge project, but it's a vast improvement. And having tried to mess with the website many, many times in my life, I am so pleased. So thank you.
Anything else?
I'm waiting for that number.
That number. I want to say it's Mom or Keche, but I'm gonna confirm that. I don't want to go on the record until I know for sure what that third most common language is.
All right, and then lastly, you were going to update us on the outreach about the new school buildings.
Yes. And I would invite Mr. Tracy to jump in here, or Dr. Blakey to jump in if you'd like to, if there's anything that I've missed that you'd like to add. So again, we have updated information on our current website that will give any family member, any resident, any member of our community who wants access to information regarding our capital construction projects at New Garden or Greenwood Elementary School, access to that information, regardless of whether or not they can attend events. So what you see here is a screenshot of that page, and if you were to scroll a little further down, what you'd be able to access is, for example, copies of the presentation that were given very recently about the design of the New Garden Elementary School, for example. Additional information on that page includes contact information. So we have set up a dedicated email address for any member of the community who wants to email members of the administration and board regarding these projects, that they can do so and that we can monitor that. So that information is there. And then the other thing that I think is really helpful is that we've included some upcoming dates and deadlines. So dates that individuals in the community might be interested in knowing about, whether that's the date that we're going to be presenting information to members of the public, or ultimately that we're planning to ask the board to approve certain parts of the project. So all of that information will be kept up to date at all times. And again, this is a wonderful place to go if you are in doubt or have any questions about where we're at in these projects.
And will the virtual tour be part of that package?
Those videos were so good, weren't they?
Good? Yeah.
So Mr. Tracy and I have talked a couple of times about getting those videos and actually embedding them. File size is currently, I think, the holdup, but once we get the lower resolution version of the files, we will make sure that they're
And is there a way to contact, say, the parents of all the kids who are in the system right now, who will eventually be attending that school, email them with a link to the video so they can see what's happening?
And you read my mind,
There you
because in the next version, thank you, Mr. Bowden. No, in the next version of the KCSD Connection, we will be including an update that has a link out to this page. And what we've discussed with Mr. Tracy and Mr. Wolhoff is that we will have an update in every version of the KCSD Connection newsletter that we send out monthly, so that it is constantly visible to members of our community and that they don't have to go looking for that information. But yes, as soon as those videos get added, we'll be doing another push. And finally, I just wanted to put the dates here on the board, that these are those upcoming opportunities for members of our public who have an interest in being involved, that they are welcome to do so.
All right, thank you. Any more questions for Nikki on any of these subjects? Nope.
We'll have to talk. I'm not sure.
No. Okay, is there any further business we need to conduct?
We need to adjourn.
All right, we're done here. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you especially to Nikki.
It's after 7. Okay, seeing as it's after 7, we're going to bring this meeting to order. So if the whole audience can just quiet down and take their seats. Okay. Well, thank you. I mean, the roll call, I did not hear from Dr. McVeigh today and our other committee person. He was still this week? Oh, he was out last week. Okay, so Dr. McVeigh is out of town still. We have Dr. Garrett here, and then we have Mr. Cronenberg. We have Mr. Kramer and various administrators. So let's jump right into it. So there's our roll call. We're going to move right to Mr. Tracy with the budget timeline. Mr. Tracy with his dapper new suit here.
Thank you, Mr. Finnegan. It's a new old suit. How's that sound? We're going to start off with the budget timeline. We are sticking to it for this evening. It is highlighted in yellow on the board, on board docs. This is March 6th. At our Finance Committee meeting, we had scheduled the long-range plan for technology, and Dan McGuire is with us. He's done this for many years, but we've been sticking to this 5-year plan, both for technology and for capital improvements. As well, this evening, we're going to take another look at our capital financing analysis. This is the debt that we will be incurring for the new construction of 2 elementary schools. Just a quick reminder, we did a $10 million bond issue in November of 2022. We will be looking at doing the first of 2 rather large issues, one in the $45 to $50 million issue sometime either late this year or early next year, and then a subsequent $50 million issuance in likely 24 late or early 25 to complete the financing for the 2 new buildings. So we're going to take a little look at that. One of the things that will be happening tomorrow, the governor will be releasing the state budget in Pennsylvania. It's a little bit late. Typically, we have that ready for the March Finance Committee meeting. I will send off what I can as it gets sort of dissected by the various houses, and we'll take a look at what that means to Ken in the revenue source. So I will give the board and the committee a preview of what that will look like, and then we'll report out in April. So we'll have some information for you. Just to highlight something else, we were out on the deregulated electrical market. We were bidding along with many districts. Provident Energy is the consultant. We had talked previously of a bump of 30 to 40%. It was significantly less. So we are locking in on a 24-month. I will have that analysis for you at the April meeting. But we actually increased that line item, well over 200,000. So we're going to be able to pull a lot of that back. There's always something that also, it's a balancing act. So if something goes up, something has to come down. In this case, electricity went down, workers' comp is up significantly. So Penny Schaefer is taking a look at that right now. It has a lot to do with mod rates. We had 2 long-term teachers that were out on workers' comp, as well as a lot of COVID-related expenses that were paid out for the last several years. So that is increasing our mod rate. Once again, our workers' comp is self-insured with about 66 other districts. So we'll take a look at that and have an update as well in April for you. But overall, right now, the budget process is looking really good. I'll have our medical prescription, second look, our renewal numbers finalized in the month of March. So we'll also have that in April. So April, I think we're going to have a much better look at where that final budget will ultimately settle. And then we'll look at a proposed final budget approval at the month of April. With that said, Dan McGuire has completely reviewed his report with me. There's a lot of information, and certainly he is going to give you somewhat of a summary review of it. But if you need anything else, Dan will certainly sit down with any one of the committee members of the board and dig deeper into some of the analysis. A lot of the technical aspects of his presentation go over my head, and I hear it regularly from Dan. So with that, we can just turn it over to Dan McGuire, and he'll run through his presentation.
On to you, Dan.
All right, thank you. Mr. Tracy, Mr. Finnegan, thank you for your time, continued support, the opportunity to review our plan, celebrate our progress the district continues to make towards realizing our vision of connected teaching and learning, always focusing on student achievement. As I updated the packet this year, and I hope nobody looked at the page number, as we know we're not going to go through every page of the 62-page plan, I quickly realized the only changes I really need to make on the first 2 pages are the dates in the table of contents, as our goals and objectives continue to be the same. And these goals, which we established in the District Strategic Planning Committee in 2007, believe it or not, continue to be the focus of everything we do. And as we went over our district-bound scorecard last week, they proved to be more applicable than ever. So one thing I did was I did a little bit of digging. I couldn't help myself. And what I was able to find was the 2007 fall newsletter, which I will share with you as well, which highlights the strategic plan, but also highlights a few other technology highlights way back when. So I wanted to take some time and really talk about what we've learned since 2007. The first thing we've learned is that devices will change. We've definitely come a long way in 16 years. When the three of our teachers, our first teachers, received the first of our Smartboard grants as part of our Smart Grant Program, which Dr. Garrett had instituted, which we had a grant program, a couple teachers each year submitted their application, to now we have over 300 interactive projectors throughout the district. So we've come a long way since 2013. Something else that will change is that the people will change in some cases. The article on page 3 includes some quotes from our newly hired district technology integration coach, who sits before you today, obviously much older than back then, but definitely those people have changed, the individuals have changed, as well as the devices. The program software and hardware will change. The costs will change. The circumstances of how and where our students learn will change. The methods of how we deliver instruction will change. The needs of our students will change. But what will never change is our focus on students and doing everything we can to meet their needs. And in Kennett, it's always about the students first and technology second. But I thought you would appreciate this. Way back when, 2007, I remember being on that committee with Steve Mancini. It was a pretty exhausting strategic plan, but I went back and I looked at our goals. They're exactly the same goals that we set out forth in 2007 that we're holding true today, and they are aligning with the balanced scorecard. So it's definitely something that we've been focusing on for all this time. So I thought you'd appreciate that. So going into our technology plan, and I have it before you as well as what Mr. Tracy said, we have a more detailed list. Be more than happy to review it for you. So I have it up on the screen as well in front of you for your reference. Our objectives this year include increased accessibility through strategic integration, expanding our resources and support for everyone throughout the school community, and maintaining our long-term goal of sustainability. So moving forward, we're focusing especially on maximizing instructional time and using our existing resources while looking to expand and integrate systems to empower our staff, students, and parents while improving overall safety, security, and data protection. And as I said, for the sake of time, I will not be going through all the aspects of the plan in full detail, but rather focus on some of the more significant components of the plan and hopefully lead to some discussions. And at any time, please don't hesitate to stop me and ask any questions as we go through with the presentation or the packet that's in front of you. Before I get started, I'd like to take a moment. I know the majority of the members of the technology department are listening online, some of which had previous engagements. So I wanted to take a moment to recognize Mark, Bob, Ken, Kevin, Tom, Mike, Brad, Julie, Adriana, and Kelly, our instructional technology coach, because we've made a tremendous amount of progress, not only this year, but in the past 13 years, significantly to achieving our goals. So moving forward, we really like to celebrate this first. I know it looks like just a lot of numbers strewn across a couple columns, but I'd like to review our 5-year capital plan. But before we do, take a moment to briefly share our 2013 capital plan, which in comparison to 10 years later, if you do a snapshot, illustrates the continued support of the board and how much progress we've made towards sustainability in the area of technology. What you're looking at are all of the areas that we had to dedicate capital funds to since 2013 in order to get us to where we are. So take a snapshot of then to here, significant progress towards sustainability, and that's with the board's support with the continued infusion of funding. For clarification for everyone, the capital projects are those funds that are funded outside of the general operating budget. And aside from one-time significant expenditures such as infrastructure upgrades, we continue to work towards absorbing reoccurring expenditures into the general fund through annual infusions. So thank you once again. We've come a long way. Still have a ways to go, but definitely have made a significant progress. I don't want to bounce back and forth between the appendices within the packet, but in Appendix AG that was sent and shared with the board, I've included for your reference a detailed breakdown and description of all the equipment related to our district infrastructure, including storage, backup, and all of the related equipment, as well as our budget notes and replacement timelines. However, for the sake of time, I'll simply provide a brief description of the devices and the related expenditures for each, but please feel free, as always, to stop me at any time. So what I'll do is focus on our capital plan for the next 5 years, beginning with our phone system upgrade and starting with the top tier, which is our infrastructure projects. For 2022-23, $60,000 was dedicated to the replacement of existing physical phones. And as we discussed at the January Finance Committee meeting, we are transitioning from our current Cisco on-prem solution to a WebEx cloud-based environment for our district phone system for several reasons, including reliability, security, functionality for our staff, and long-term cost savings. Mark Fisher, who also manages our district and building networks and surveillance systems, will be supervising the phone system upgrade from a district perspective, along with support from Ken Altizer and Mike Donovan from our department. Moving on to 24-25, moving on to the next column, capital projects related to our data center, $25,000 for the replacement of a smart UPS data center battery backup solution. So what you're seeing for next year is we have a battery backup solution, and you can imagine the core of everything we do, we lose power, we have to have a backup. We have a backup generator, but in order to make sure that that transition is seamless, it flips over to a battery backup, which flips over to a generator backup. So that system, as you can imagine, to run the heart of everything that we do is a pretty significant expenditure. So that's why we have it as a capital project for next year. Moving on to 24-25. $156,000 comes from $72,000 for the annual server refresh for one node of our VxRail. So basically, our VxRail is a hyper-converged infrastructure solution for everything for computing, storage, and networking into one single appliance. The reason why we transitioned to this last year is instead of replacing the entire appliance, we can then transition one node out of the 4 over the course of 4 years for significantly less. The original cost that we got for this particular appliance was well over $800,000. We got it for over $250,000, but now for the long term, as we start to replace the nodes versus replacing the entire appliance, it's much more sustainable, as you can see, versus several hundreds of thousands of dollars. The $84,000 in addition to that on the 24-25 year is for the replacement of a redundant in-row cooling system in the data center. So you can imagine all of that equipment in one room. It gives off a lot of heat, so we have to have an in-row solution that constantly is cycling the air out. Moving on, 25-26 is the second year of a 4-year refresh for that node for VxRail, plus our core switch for that year. Financially, from a solid standpoint for our core switch, is it's E-ratable. So that means we get a 60% discount from E-rate. And our core switch is basically the backbone of everything we do in the district. It's our entire network service and serves as a gateway. So in 25-26, that's when we're planning on refreshing it and applying for E-rate services at that time. The last 2 years, 26-27, first one is the $148,000 is for $76,000 for our redundant firewalls. So we expanded a few years ago and got redundant firewalls, one of which is E-ratable, the other one is not. We absorb the full cost of that. And a firewall is basically a network security system that monitors and controls all incoming, outgoing traffic and identifies trusted internal traffic and external traffic. So that's also E-ratable. And then last for infrastructure is the $72,000 in the 27-28 year for our last annual server refresh for our VxRail.
Dan, what's the difference between making a firewall E-ratable and not?
So we have 2 redundant firewalls. So the one is actually, you can't get E-rate funding for both. You can only go for one appliance. So what it does is it gives a whole nother level of security when we have redundant ones. One goes down, we still have another level of security. Plus with a firewall, you're able to set the permissions to allow for traffic based upon network traffic, whether you're seeing a lot of attacks, those types of things. Now that it's redundant, we now have a backup for that firewall. And the fact that it's E-ratable is that one, because it's a district infrastructure, we get a 60% discount on the main, which allows us some flexibility to go redundant.
So the redundant systems are the one they're not?
Yes.
Not, okay.
Mm-hmm. Any questions about the top tier? Much easier than the years prior when it used to take us the hour and 45 minutes to go through each one of these. So we're not going to be spending that amount of time. However, what you will see in Appendix AG are the data center projects full detail explanation, but you'll also see in the appendix, it breaks down the timeline back to 2013 as we started to transition everything from the capital projects to the general operating budget. The goal is to not go backwards. However, as we know, the cost of these appliances for infrastructure are significant, but the ultimate goal is that we retain those three tiers and really just keep it to those significant projects. So if there's no questions about the infrastructure, we'll take a moment and transition to the lower tier, which is staff and student devices. And what you'll see in 22-23 is the $70,000 for the cost of 100 staff devices. And if you remember a couple years ago, we started to get into the sustainable budget where we would be purchasing 100 staff devices each year for around 400 or 500 devices and then replenishing them every year instead of bulk purchasing every 4 years. From a sustainability standpoint, the budget is much easier to come up with 100 devices, but from a support standpoint, we now only have to work with 100 staff members versus 400 throughout the year and replace it as we go forward. If you remember, we made the switch several years ago. We don't discuss Acer, but several years ago from the MacBooks to the Acer to the Dells. Very pleased. We are now working on our third generation Latitudes, which are the 3420s. Thankfully, Dell and our partnership has maintained the price point at around a $700 price point for a more robust and a higher performing machine. We've been very pleased with Dell. What you're noticing is from 2023 on for staff devices, that is the $50 infusion of general funding into the general operating budget, which directly reduces the push from our capital projects for staff devices. So if we continue down this path, I envision that within the next year, staff devices are now completely in the general operating budget and are out of a capital project. Okay. My concern as it is with any other hardware is that you might have a processor or they change the model so significantly that the price point jumps up. So there's always that fear, but our partnership with Dell has been solid. And if you recall, any device that we purchase with Dell, whether it's a student device or a staff device, we actually add on a SKU that gets us professional services to partner with Bob Dylan and our personalized learning partners to keep that initiative going. So that's something that Dell has marked in for not only next year, but as we continue to move forward. Every device we buy, we get professional services in time. So we're continuing that partnership. And we could talk about personalized learning a little bit further. For student devices, this is where it gets a little bit more interesting. For 23-24, $153,500 is the total. $133,500 of that is for the current cost of 500 Chromebooks, which is about half of the student devices we plan to refresh annually, plus $20,000 for next year to purchase devices in support of the new elementary STEM program. So we typically are refreshing, or we're proposing refreshing 1,000 devices, but because of the continuous infusion into the general fund, we're taking 500 devices out, the cost, and putting it into the general operating budget. So what you're seeing reflected are 500 or half of student devices every year. So we're making significant gains when we're getting to a general operating budget. You'll see that same total in 26-27, which is our 4-year refresh, and that's what you'll see when we start to break it out from now for the next 12 years, how often we're refreshing devices and what grade levels they're going in. And Chrome as well as Dell have been very supportive when it comes to a 4-year refresh, which really puts us in a good spot to constantly refresh every 4 years strategically. What you'll also see in 24-25 and 27-28 also reflect that same 500 device refresh. A couple of the differences that you'll see where you have an increased price point for capital projects for student devices is in 25-26, you'll see it jump to $266,000. And what that does is that reflects the 90 Windows devices for our secondary STEM students. Our STEM students at the secondary level at this point, demand a Windows device that's able to support a lot of those more robust programs. So it jumps significantly from about a $280 price point to a $1,478 price point. So when we start having conversations about the STEM program and the Pathways program and providing students in the STEM program with their own device, we really have to look strategically because that's not afforded long-term into our general operating budget. That would be an expense we need to look at. So what we're trying to do is rather than just sit down every 4 years and say we're just constantly going to cycle, we're going to dedicate time as we do every year to working with the teachers and the leadership to identify what our plan is. We have to be very cautious and very strategic on what that looks like. But as programs start to go more and more online, the demand for a dedicated Windows device becomes less and less. So we're trying to find that happy medium. And when we talk about best and worst case scenarios for devices for the STEM labs, as you start to see the transition of that software go online, are dedicated labs where we want to go. And that's a question for us to discuss as a group with leadership, with the teachers, because Project Lead the Way has been very good, especially after COVID or during the time of COVID, moving a lot of the online programs online, so it's accessible, but you still have some of those CAD programs and some of the programs that we use that just aren't accessible online, and it's not the same experience, but we want to have that balance, okay? So we'll work on that as we go, but we always like to put worst case scenario up there. The reason why we were able to encumber those funds when we first purchased those Windows laptops in 2020 was because we had ESSER funding, we had ECF funding, we had funding that offset other expenditures, so we were able to encumber that cost. Those funds aren't going to be there. We can't plan on grant funding being available every 4 years, so that's why we took it out and put it back in as a capital project. Okay? Any questions about the 5-year plan from a capital project standpoint?
Do we still need some Macs for any of the arts programs?
We do. So those are, and that's a great question, those are actually in our budget. And when we start to talk about refreshing those labs, we look at just like we will with STEM, worst case, best case. For the TV production studio and refresh last year in Mr. Bosch's lab, we looked at iMacs versus Mac Minis versus larger displays. And what we came up with was a mixed solution. So as students start to come in, they need the flexibility to be able to use their own device, a district device, or a Mac for specific projects. So what we did is we worked with Scott, Mr. Bosch, and put in larger displays and then went with a Mac Mini with multiple HDMI solutions. So regardless of what device they came in with, the students could plug in their district Chromebook, their own MacBook, their other Windows machine, or work with the device that's already in the lab. So for about the same price point, we were able to provide a lot more flexibility, much like the real world. You know, the students aren't going to go to, arts, they're not going to go to college, they're not going to go into the real world into a video production studio and have to use one type of program. They're going to have to identify what works best to meet their needs, and we're affording them that flexibility. So that's what we're trying to do. But we always provide the best and worst case. And just to be clear, when I say best worst case, it's financial only. We're not talking about best worst case for the student experience. We're looking at it financially. It's obviously coming from working with the teachers and the administration, but you do need to know that there, in some cases, it's a vast difference between 25 of iMacs and a mixed solution of 5 of these, 5 of these, 5 of these. And that's a decision that we work from a price point with the teachers, but really with the teachers to identify what their needs are programmatically. So moving forward.
Dan?
Yep.
Just a clarification question. I think
Sure.
you were referring, if I'm not wrong, to Appendix AG. Is that true?
AG was the appendix for,
Yeah. Dan, we don't have an AG. We have AF and then it goes to AA.
AF, and then on the one that was on the board docs is the one that doesn't include the ones for security reasons, doesn't have the data center projects in there. So that's why.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, absolutely. So with that, moving on to AB, and this is where we're referring to the best and worst case scenario from a financial standpoint only, with the unique areas that we need to refresh for next year, focusing specifically on STEM. So if you look at the best case scenario, which is the column in the left-hand side versus the right, and you have the explanation that's in the middle, the best case scenario financially for next year is to refresh our STEM labs with the Dell Precision 3260 desktops, which are slightly less expensive than the upgraded version, not much, and then postpone the high school STEM lab to the following year to offset cost. We're confident that the devices are going to make it. They'll be fine. And if we need to offset and kind of balance the cost, that's one way that we can kind of take advantage and wait another year. If we do move forward and replace all 90, the price point is there. You're looking at a closer $96,000. However, the discussion needs to be had, as we said, are dedicated labs needed? If so, how many? What's enrollment look like? Not only next year, but long term? Or are we looking for something like Mr. Bosch's lab for a flexible kind of hybrid solution where they would much prefer to have a few of the desktops with robust software and capabilities, a few larger monitors, some other Windows laptops, or do we start to expand our loaner program where we afford Windows laptops for students to take home to be able to do projects at home? These are these unique conversations that we can now have. 10 years ago, you couldn't. It had to be this. There were no other alternatives. It had to meet these requirements. Now we have some flexibility, but that's a decision that's going to be made from the teacher's perspective. And we also start to look at enrollment. We don't want to go down the path of getting 30 devices or 20 devices when the enrollment is somewhere around 5 or 10. But those are some of the questions that we ask the administration and the teachers. So moving forward, like we said, into the elementary STEM program, you're looking at best case scenario, for a mixed solution consisting of 10 tablets and 5 convertible Chromebooks. And the convertible Chromebooks are basically what you're looking at here, but they flip all the way around and turn into a tablet. So you do have, Chromebook does make a version of their, Dell makes a version of their Chromebook, flips all the way around, turns off the keyboard and turns into a tablet. There's some flexibility there. The reason being, after getting some input from teachers, is that they need the flexibility to go out and access resources, record, capture, input data, and do various things while they're outside, whether throughout the building or outside in doing some sort of experiment. The Chromebooks might not be the best, but if they could do so with a tablet or a convertible Chromebook, it might be something that they might be able to do. Knowing full well that this is a expansion of what we currently have, it's outside of our general operating budget, but if the flexibility is there, do you need 25 or do you need 5? And that's the conversations that we have. These are in addition, because they're unique classes, these are in addition to this Chromebooks that the students already have. So when you envision them coming to the STEM lab, do you need it maybe one per group, or do you need every student to have their own tablet for a STEM? And as they build the curriculum, they'll start to identify their technical needs, and then we accommodate. So that's why we have best and worst case. I like the hybrid approach because it gives the students a little bit of taste of something different, but you don't want to go with something just because you think it's going to be the best fit. So our STEM teachers now, we just received tablets for them to pilot. Each one of our elementary STEM teachers is going to be getting a tablet to pilot, as well as a Chromebook convertible to put it in the hands of the students to see which one best fits their needs. And then from there, I don't want to say beat up Dell. From there, we start to work creatively with Dell to get to a certain point to get aggressive pricing moving forward, knowing those unique classes are in addition to our sustainable budget. So those are the things we have to keep in the back of our mind. So going back to, if we can identify the sustainable solution for student devices, and that can be funded within the operating budget, that infusion target remains at approximately $153,000 we talked about, which we're on pace if we continue with that infusion for 3 years. So if we continue and we can identify a sustainable student device plan, and that can come out of the capital budget, that's 3 years that the only expenses that are going into the capital projects are those large infrastructure projects, which is an incredibly beneficial place to be. And I don't know of any other district that has a sustainable plan to that extent. So something for us to think about. Are there any questions about best or worst case scenario, refresh? I'm not going to dedicate a lot of time unless you want to get to the granular level, but this is what we have to kind of use when we start talking about strategic reallocation for Chromebooks. So basically, as we found out last year from the feedback over the last couple of years, that the student experience with Chromebooks is significantly better. And from a support standpoint, as we start to standardize K-12 devices, aside from the unique labs, our ability to sustain and our ability to support becomes so much more maximized, being able to do so. Because you can do a lot of the things from our Google Admin Console. Repairs are now to 1 or 2 different models, but basically that's where we're finding ourselves now when you look at this Appendix AC. We call it the PLE refresh, the Chromebook allocation. It just provides a grade level breakdown, color-coded by the different Chromebook models, and we said there's a 4-year refresh. So what you're looking at next year is that the first grade devices that are there now are going to be moving to the second grade classrooms. And the reason being is we needed to get 1 more year out of the 3180s, their end of life, to balance, so that in this year we're not buying 1,700 or 1,800 devices. We're trying to keep it so that it's sustainable. So the first grade devices are going to move to the second grade. And then what we do is get every 1st, 5th, and 8th grader a brand new Chromebook, and they keep it for 4 years. Graduating seniors then take it and we give them to the kindergartners, and then every 1st, 5th, and 8th grader keeps it for 4 years. Any questions about that? So the challenging part, and this is a fun graph, and I'm sorry that the font size is about a 2 when you look at it. Appendix AD, the most significant challenge with all of this is to expand to a device with every student, knowing that in 2020, 2021, we purchased 2,500 Chromebooks, all with majority of with grant money, which puts us in a very good spot and thrusts us into a 1-to-1, but also 2,500 devices that need to be refreshed within a 4 to 5 year period. The best part of that situation is Dell and Google worked to give districts and those that are purchasing in such a large quantity a lot more of a grace period, and we call it the Google auto update expiration. So instead of it being a locked 4 years, they gave us a 5 to 6 year window for some of these devices, so you're not forced to refresh after 4 years. We got a little bit of a flexibility. They have since gone back on that, so it is a standard 4 years, but it does put us in a good position that we can push, like first grade, one more year out of the 3180s to start getting into a more balanced, sustainable budget. Any questions about reallocation? This is where it gets interesting, and then we start having conversations. Well, what do you do with, the spares that you have? You look at the enrollment, and you only need 907 devices, but we're purchasing 1,000. As you can imagine, there are some losses during the year. There are some damages during the year. For next year, we're working on a Chromebook protection plan to allow the parents to enroll, which a lot of other districts, much like the teacher insurance program, that it covers the device, those types of things. But you're going to have some instances, most of which are accidental, where you have losses, and we want to be readily available at the libraries. And I have to acknowledge the library teams who, at the building level, are the ones that really are the kiosk for incoming devices, processing devices that need to be replaced, and they also have a bank of spares at every building, so a student doesn't go a minute without a device. So if a device is in need of repair or need basic troubleshooting, we have a building manager from the tech department, but they stop down that instantaneously, have a loaner, it's then checked out. That student keeps the loaner until their assigned device is handed back to them. So the library teams have absolutely been critical in doing that since COVID and since the return. Any questions about what we were thinking about? If you take a look at 23-24, at what point would it be appropriate to prepare the fifth graders to get them ready for middle school to take their devices home each and every day? So we'll work with the teachers on what that looks like, but we're figuring come January or February every year, the expectations that fifth graders should start bringing their device home to and from every day, because at middle school, that's what the expectation is. 6 through 12, you are expected to bring it to and from every day. Are all students doing it every day? I would like to say yes, but I would be lying. So we're reinforcing it. Plus, when we start to get into MAP assessments, we start to get into iReady diagnostics, PSSA's Keystones, we will be reinforcing with parents and the students they must bring their district Chromebook back because they're configured specifically for those assessments. We do not administer assessments or allow students to do their assessments on their personal devices. They can't be managed. So we do have some spares. We have assessment carts that the board has been supporting for years that we strategically place in the buildings as spares, but we start to reinforce now. Be sure to start bringing your devices and your chargers every day so that when assessments come around, you have your district device with you every day. Any questions about reallocation? I feel like I'm moving very fast, but that's okay. And I also feel you guys are okay with that. Okay. This is a very exciting chart. And I look at it knowing I'm getting more and more into the numbers, but it's very exciting to know. This really celebrates the commitment, the district's commitment towards sustainability and less reliance on capital funds through the continued infusion of funding into the general operating budget. So you see the cells that are highlighted in green. It's a little bit tough to see, but I think you can still make them out. Those are the areas where funding infusions have happened over the years, including the upcoming year for the 23-24 budget with another $50,000 infusion into our new equipment. As we start to infuse over the years, you start to see directly now, you start to see those projects coming out of capital projects. And as we said, within 3 years, we will have a fully sustainable general operating budget when we're talking about student devices. Any questions about this chart as well? All right, so I am not going through line by line, but I wanted to provide as a point of reference. Appendix AF really gives you a detailed breakdown in the timeline of the capital projects throughout the district. It also gives you a definitive timeline when those projects were shifted into the general operating budget. So it'll tell you at what point, what the cost was, how significant it was, and then when we shifted into the general operating budget, and a breakdown for the majority of the program or majority of the projects, including wireless refresh, network switches. It also indicates within here the years that we're going to be refreshing strategically each building. What of these projects is E-ratable? So you're starting to really see it starting to come together. So that's a detailed breakdown. And at any point, I'm not asking you to digest all this information, but please read it over, and I'm happy to sit down and go over it in more detail. Okay. This is the Appendix AG that I shared. I'll just share very briefly, giving you a breakdown of the data center projects that we talked about, what each does, what the refresh timeline does, what the expenditure is, and where the funding sources are that we shared with you separately. And then finally, Appendix AH, where it gives you an overview of E-rate, ESSER, ECF funding that we were able to take advantage of, including a lot of the equipment that we were able to purchase through federal funds over the years. We just reapplied 2 years ago for E-rate. We are still at a 60% discount. And later on the board agenda, we have applied for and have received a proposal for wireless access points for this year that I'll go over briefly for the board review for our E-rate application for this upcoming year. Any questions? All right. The last appendix highlights the more significant district initiatives that are supported and are driven by the tech department, many of which we discussed last week at the Balanced Scorecard goal monitoring presentation during the curriculum committee meeting. The first 2 pages of the appendix outline, describe the enhancements, the systems, the procedures implemented both internally and district-wide to accommodate for an ever-increasing demand placed upon our technology department. So although the increase is constantly occurring when it comes to tech support, and it's indicated through the data that's there through our work orders, it continuously increases. We have done a lot of things internally within the department, identifying building managers and project managers, support enhancements, really focusing, and this is all outlined in our Balanced Scorecard, really focusing on cross-training, professional development, and doing a lot of things within our work order system to maximize our time. And we talked about it earlier, using our resources at the libraries to offset some of the demand. So we're constantly trying to refine what we do, and we meet on a weekly basis, either as a department or individually, to go over individual goals and department goals. And it's something that we take a lot of pride in doing, and we've constantly been refining as we go. So what we've also done, as we talked about throughout here, with your support, talking about looking at the department and looking at restructuring the job titles, restructuring the tiers so that they align more with the increased responsibilities and job duties, as well as the salaries that can be adjusted for each. Those are something that I'm going to work for at the district level to try to realign it. The job titles that we currently haven't been looked at in several years, and as you can imagine, even pre-COVID, a lot of the responsibilities that every member of the department has kind of taken on has far exceeded those original job titles and salary ranges. So it's something that I would like to look at a little bit more deeply as we go. Any questions about the department enhancements? And I'll just jump into a couple of the initiatives. I could stay all night and celebrate what the department and the district has been able to accomplish and what we continue to do on a day-to-day basis, but there's 2 really I want to focus on. The first, I want to take this opportunity to recognize Tom Ryan for his expertise, dedication to facilitating, if you can imagine how monumentous of a task it was to upgrade our SIS, as well as Kevin Bridges for supporting throughout the entire process. If you can imagine upgrading a system that's the core of everything you do. We talked about it last year. Tom came up with a strategic plan, a timeline, a phase-in approach, professional development, training, and support throughout that entire process. So I wanted to take a moment to thank both Tom and Kevin for all they've done and continue to do to support that upgrade for our SIS. Since then, and it's an indication of how successful it went, multiple districts have reached out to Tom, and I think I mentioned this last week. Multiple districts have reached out to Tom for some insight and guidance as they're planning their own transition. And Tom has also been asked by representatives from Skyward to join them at their keynote address at their national conference. Whether or not Tom decides to do so and go on stage at a keynote address remains to be seen, but he is going to be asked to facilitate a session for districts that are going through the transition. So that's a testament that not only do we know how well the transition went and how great of a job Tom did, it's known outside the district and people are coming to him for his expertise. Okay. The last, I don't want to say initiative because it's been something that we've been working on for quite some time. But as I said, any of those initiatives that are in there that you'd like to talk about more, I'd be happy to do so. The last initiative that I'd like to talk about in the appendix is our personalized learning environment. And if you'll take a look at the timeline, believe it or not, 2022-23 is year 5 of our initiative, which is tough for me to imagine. But I believe we've made the most impact this year because we've expanded the discussion from the middle school to include all buildings. And we've continued that partnership with Bob Dylan. And as I said before, that initial partnership goes back 3 or 4 years where we were able to work with ALP and Dell to secure days of professional development and training through Dell with Bob Dylan, and we're continuing to keep that cycle going. So Bob has been on site for 2 days in January, 2 days in February, and has been working with us throughout the year, strategically trying to find entry points, and ways to start and expand the conversation of personalized learning at every one of our buildings. So we appreciate that partnership. It's working out very well. And you're really starting to see, as I go through some of the resources, that the seed has been planted and the conversation is there. And I can say that the teachers aren't looking at it as something new, something different, and something more. They're just looking for strategic ways to kind of integrate it on a more balanced, organic way. Which is what we want. We don't want personalized learning to be looked at as something else. It's basically good instruction. And what we're looking at really is the Kennett Core 4, looking at interests of the students, looking at valuing student input, teacher choice, and really empowering students is what we're looking at and focusing on. And we've come up with this through conversations with our teachers, the Kennett Core 4. Those are the 4 areas of personalized learning that we're looking at. So as we start to look at and we start to align personalized learning, we continue our work with Bob. I also wanted to include in the packet at the end that original study that we did in 2019, 2020 in collaboration with Jake Moore, and he deserves all the acknowledgement. But we definitely supported the hypothesis that PLE positively impacts student satisfaction, interest, and engagement, which was the rationale why we moved forward. Looking at it from a technology standpoint, if you remember that original pilot, we gave a cohort group a cart of Chromebooks to do the pilot. Then we did a control group, started to do different types of activities, worked with Bob Dylan, did a survey, and there was a direct correlation between personalized learning and student achievement, which was our impetus to move forward. So it wasn't a tech initiative. We just wanted to level the playing field so that it didn't become a barrier for anything that we wanted to implement for personalized learning. And since then, we continue to integrate. So I wanted to include that and provide those of you that weren't aware where it all came from when we're talking about PLE initiative in Kennett. Are there any questions about personalized learning, any of those district initiatives, 5-year plan, next year's budget that I could answer at this point? And I didn't look at the time once, but I feel I'm doing okay.
You're doing just great.
Okay.
And I do encourage, everyone here and everyone not here to read through the whole presentation and ask Dan questions. But I do want to say that the job that you in the department have been doing has just been phenomenal. I mean, the tasks that have been added, over the decade have been a factor of hundreds, and the staff has not been increased a factor of hundreds. I remember the days back when every year it was another big infusion from capital projects for Mac leases, for hundreds of battery replacements, and they were all annual surprises. So the fact that you worked it all out so that it could be phased in with the refreshes so that it all gets worked into the general budget. It's very, very proactive and very sustaining. And I thank you and your huge staff for
thank you
for doing all that. I mean, as we saw last week, just the data and the analytics we're getting from Linkit in the curriculum meeting was eye-opening, and that's going to lead to the improvements we're going to need in the PLEs to address what we found from that. So it's getting all this data to a point where we can collect it and analyze it and then figure out how to best educate the students. It's just can't say enough about it. So
thank you.
Any other questions here?
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Dan. I note the PLE study, and then I think that ran us right into COVID, didn't it?
Yes. So you want to look at the timing? Was it great? I would have liked it one more year previously, because then every student would have had their own Chromebook, and we wouldn't have had to be pulling to get every student a device, because we weren't a one-to-one when we first went through. But it was the focal point of an entire year, and Jake Moore pushing through that initiative, working strategically on the study and working with district leadership really yielded justification for us to move forward with it. It wasn't a technology initiative. It was an instructional one, and it's just good instruction. But it did prove that if you implement these strategies, students are more invested, the achievement gets higher. So we have no choice but to move forward. We've proved that it works. We just now need to embrace it and expand it throughout the district. So yes.
And I'd like to second what Mr. Finnegan just said. It's wonderful for me. I still think of myself as a new board member, even though that's about to change. But it's wonderful for me to understand our financial picture, both through the technology department as well as through the entire finance department. You project things out and you roll them over on a year-to-year basis so that it's integrated and it's consistent and it's steady. And that's wonderful for me as an elected financial planner. So congratulations to both of you on that. You said we haven't investigated the position titles of the technology department?
For quite some time.
I feel like I saw them recently. And I should preface that by saying the technology department rocks, and it's clear that they rock. And, the work that they've done in the last 3 years proves that. And my questions about it don't impact my opinion. I'm just trying to clarify. So we haven't seen the titles change recently?
We haven't. We've seen 1 or 2 titles change. But we haven't seen widespread changes. And what we're trying to look to do is consolidate the tiers of the technology department so that you have opportunities for advancement. It aligns the job responsibilities, align with the job titles, so that it's more of not only what they've done to this point, but really where we're going forward. And as we talked about with the enhancements, we now have building managers and project managers. We're not techs really anymore. You have a support mechanism that's in place that far surpasses not only within the district and with staff and students, but now in the community. So we have members of our department, all members of the department, when we start to expand new employees, new families, we've now expanded that support, and COVID thrust us into that as well. We have the capacity to do so much more. The job titles they're outdated.
And I guess that takes me sort of into my next point, which is we as a board, or at least I as a board member, don't have much outreach with a significant portion of the district employees, right? We work with the teachers through the union, we work through the top level administrators, but for people in the tech department and other 2 downs, 3 downs, whatever they may be, I'm sure that we do, but I just want to state my emphasis that I support retention goals and, making sure that there are those avenues for advancement. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. Appreciate your
Thank
support.
you.
Here to that. Second that. I have, in the last couple of months, spent a lot of time with potential candidates for various offices in the region. And so the question that keeps coming up is, what does this elected officialdom entail? I want to say, with respect to this technology, one of the jobs, obviously, of an elected official is to sort of do triage and to look for the obvious trouble and the trouble that you get when you have your ear to the ground. I keep my ear to the ground pretty thoroughly, and I also have figured out, the things that I know go wrong with technology programs. And I would concur when you speak to the idea that for example, our program is more sustainable than most, and I won't say that all, but I think that is exactly the conclusion that I've drawn is, one, if there were technology issues happening, we would hear howling. So I think that's important to note, and it really is an extraordinary challenge. One of the places that I've been really stunned is the degree to which it appears that Latina families and those who are often on the wrong side of the digital divide have not had the problems that were anticipated. And I thought that was going to be a major thing that as a board we would have to deal with all the time, was how to get around the digital divide in those terms. And what I found instead is that by some extraordinary, and it's not magic because you can see all the text behind it, right? This is well thought through programming. This department, your department, and you have figured out how to avoid the pitfalls that I saw happening. The integration with instruction, I think, is important. I think that's shines through. This idea that you're pushing towards less capital infusion and more predictable general operating budget, that's very, very important, especially for an elected body, as Mr. Cronenberg said, that needs to plan a budget and needs to be able to understand it, but also explain it to constituents. So all of those things are just really extraordinary. And I do think it's important for us to support those things that where we can support. So for example, if it's possible to re-examine those job titles, that's a place where we can, put our emphasis behind saying we support any way that we can acknowledge our employees. And I would say the other part that I want to close with is that we should make sure that in that acknowledgement of those job titles, we also acknowledge that this is not that technical support, these are educators, that you cannot do this kind of work, and it comes up repeated through this document. You cannot do this kind of work if you don't understand how technology and education fit together, and if you are not student-centered. So the proof is in the pudding in this case, and I hope that when you move very quickly and there are not lots of technical questions, it's because it's very clear that the fluency of your fluency and the fluency of your department also is reflected in the outcomes. So deeply grateful for the work you do, and I think, when I hear of some howling, I'm sure going to come to you right away. But to this point, I think it's just an extraordinary accomplishment. And I do think we owe you all a debt of gratitude. And I'd appreciate it if you'd name those members of your department one more time before you leave.
Sure. I want to make sure I don't forget anybody. I'll never hear the end of that. Ken Altizer, Kevin Bridges, Mike Donovan, Mark Fisher, Tom Ryan, Julia Sanchez, Brad Shomo, Bob Wilson, and Adriana Leon, along with Kelly Figueroa, who's our tech integration coach.
Thanks to all of them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Round of applause.
Thank you. And if people on that list are out listening, then, thank you. Congratulations as well. And you had something you wanted to say about the E-rates?
Yes. We did apply for E-rate this year, and we are going for the 2023-24 proposal was for 60 access points for New Garden and Greenwood. We did a evaluation of 2 providers. Of those 2 providers, one, Dolphin Datacom, provided us with a comparative quote for Juniper and Ruckus. We are deciding to move forward with the board's support, move forward with the Juniper Mist AP solution, and working with Mark Fisher, who manages our wireless network. There's a lot more flexibility, a lot of ability to be able to manage from remotely versus having to be on site. And there's also analytics and capabilities that go far beyond what we're able to do right now with our Ruckus solution. So the bid that we got for that price point was $69,000. With the E-rate discount, it comes to about $27,000 for the district's portion. So I wanted to propose that to the board for review. And then this also keeps us on our around a 5-year refresh. Our main concern, although it'd be much easier to not apply for it and go through the steps in the process, then you start to snowball to next year where you add those 60 access points to next year. Sustainability becomes an issue. More so, the ability to have the capacity to install, configure those goes from a manageable 50 or 60 to 160, 200, which you don't want to get to. So those are the types of things we want to keep going with that refresh cycle that we included within the plan, but just wanted to put it in front of the board for transparency.
That makes sense. Divide and conquer. Mm-hmm. Great. Well, any other questions for Dan? Well, thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
And I think the last thing on our agenda is a review of the financing analysis for our different financing plans for the debt service for the elementary schools. Mr. Tracy?
Thank you, Mr. Finnegan, and while Mr. McGuire gets that up and running, I just wanted to say, I think Mr. Kramer said it best. I'm going to go back to when we hired Dan McGuire in his current capacity. The district was at a point where we were either looking for a technology leader or a instructional technology leader to run the department. We had a hardware side and a software side, and then we had the instructional tech. So years ago, this board and administration made a commitment to really go with a instructional technology leader to oversee the entire district's technology. And exactly what you heard this evening, Dan's passion, his planning, not only year, but multiple year planning. I mean, his attention to detail is to be commended. And once again, his mission is always to maximize our resources for the students and deliver support, as I think all of our support departments do, putting students first and really trying to, uphold our instructional programs. And I think he's done an outstanding job at that. As well as I want to thank this board and prior boards for the support of making that move. Going through the lean years of 2005, 6, 7, when we stripped the general operating budget of support for technology, we had multiple Apple leases that were running consecutively. And really, it's taken a decade of time to really reach the point that we're at today. And really now, as Dan mentioned, within another 3 years, we're going to finally see the result of all that support from the board and the community to make that shift from funding kind of haphazardly to really a long-term sustainable solution. So, I think we're going to be there. And certainly we've already looked at the balanced scorecard initiatives. A lot of those are heavy tech, one-to-one, STEM programs, degree programs. It's all incorporated now. So, kudos to the board and thank you for your ongoing support.
And I do have one more question for Dan, which kind of leads into Mark's conversation here, but you worked everything out to about 2026 when we open up the new buildings. What happens to the tech that's in the old buildings? I'm assuming we're putting all new tech in the new buildings.
Well, the access points, and that's one of the reasons why we're doing Greenwood and New Garden. It's transferable if need be to go to the new building. That's why we want to get the newest ones in there and keep that cycle going. The other tech, when we're looking at interactive projectors and things like that, the newer Epsons, and we're trying to replace as needed. We don't want to have old projectors that are in classrooms that aren't operable. The Epsons that we have replaced it with are at a higher price point, but they're getting a 10-year lifespan because they're laser versus the bulbs. So when we replace, we're replacing, the software pretty much stays the same. So the interaction from an instructional standpoint is consistent, but the fact that you're going from a 4 to 5 year with the original smartboards that we used to get from an older technology to something that's 10 years, that's an easily transferable technology. So I feel confident that if we're replacing them in New Garden and Greenwood with the new Epsons, they'll transfer over to the new building. But we're trying to do it very strategically. We're not replacing them all now. We're replacing them as needed.
So anything that doesn't have a long life cycle, you're probably working on a refresh to hit right around
that same time.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Yep.
For the new building. Back to you, Mr. Tracy.
Thank you. This evening's presentation is more of a continuation of a discussion that we've been having for several months. I know that we've had several board members ask questions, raise concerns about the duration of the proposed financing for the 2 new elementary schools. Once again, I started off talking about the total project cost being somewhere in around $110 million. We certainly will know more after the first bid awards come in later this year for New Garden. So we're not going to borrow all the money at once. We're looking at a 3-phase borrowing. We borrowed $10 million. I needed that seed money to pay architects and engineers and permitting fees. This coming month, for the first time in the treasurer's report, you'll start seeing the accounting of the project. So you'll see the revenue source of that first $10 million coming in, as well as all the expenses to date that we've incurred, broken out by the various components of those expenses. So you'll see that in March's treasurer's report. The second wave of the borrowing really is timed. Another $50 million will come in right after we receive the bids for New Garden Elementary School, which is projected at about $50 million. And then the third one subsequently will happen once we end up getting through that first about $40 million. We'll start having draw schedules based upon the construction schedules and issuing that final phase. So really looking at 3 parts. So any decision the board makes currently or in this budget cycle isn't one that is in perpetuity. We're going to get a chance to review this. We're going to get a chance to review the bid numbers. What we're really trying to do is take a look at this preliminary budget and then again the final budget in June and really set the framework for how this bond issue is going to be financed and how many years, I think, is the key factor. So one of the things that I was asked to produce is taking a look at the various costs of the bond issues. And what you're seeing on the chart in front of you, and Dan, if you could turn to page 1, I believe I think we're on page 2. There we go. So page 1 is breaking down the 3 actual options that we looked at. And we've just been looking at options based upon the duration of paying back the bonds. Every year you're going to make 2 payments on these bonds. You're going to pay one of just principal and then one of interest and then one of principal and interest. All right, so we're going to be making 2 debt service payments a year. Based upon the duration, you're going to be making those 2 payments either for 24, 28, or 31 years. All right, so it's just your mortgage. Just think of it as that residential mortgage when you go out. Are you looking at a 15-year, a 20-year, or a 30? This is basically the same scenario, just with $110 million at stake. When you start looking at that, really, certainly interest compounds. The longer you draw that out, the more interest you're going to pay. So you can see it up on the chart. I don't think I need to walk you through that, but certainly 24 years, you're going to be paying $96 million of interest over the duration. And long-term 31, you'd be paying $127 million in interest. There are opportunities, and Dr. Garrett had a financial advisor that she knows very well review some of this information that I put together in his presentation, and it really just follows a yield curve that is moving up slowly, which is a good thing. So the longer we go out, we're not paying 6, 8, 10% in the future because the yield curve is relatively flat. If we see interest rates continue to spike and speculation in the market, and the long-term interest rates go up, so we're borrowing short-term at 3.5 and long-term at 8, that would be more of a traditional yield curve, that longer duration is going to be much greater. So there's some of the things that we can take a look at. Also, we will have the opportunity to refinance after about 10 years. The bonds that we're looking at will have call dates, which means you can't refinance, you can't pay early, you basically have to wait for those calls. So the investors who are buying these municipal-free bonds, they want to guarantee a certain level of return. So to do that, we put calls. You can sometimes get a 5-year call. However, the market and the interest rates really are more, I would say, in our interest to issue a long-term call, about a 10-year call. So the first time that you'll be able to refinance the debt would be in about 10 years. All right, so 10 years from our first issue, which was November of 2022. If we issue later this year, it would be 10 years from that issue. So just keep that in mind. It's not something that we can easily refinance. If interest rates suddenly drop 2 years from now, you're going to be locked in for 10 years at whatever these debt schedules look like. All right, so if you decide to go 31 and you have buyer's remorse 2 years later, you're going to be stuck for 10 years until you can refinance those bonds. All right, so this is a long-term window, at least a minimum of 10 years before you're going to be able to revisit it once you issue the bonds.
Are the amounts at the bottom the annual debt service contributions?
The amounts are not. Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, they are. 7.25, 7.75, and then our last recommendation, which was per the Finance Committee's recommendation board, was the 8.5. It's a little bit short of that right now. We're making some internal adjustments to hit that number.
So what it appears to me is if we pay less, 7.25 million annually, the debt service is shorter. And that doesn't make sense to me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Do I have it inverted? I've only looked at it about 100 times. It's an amount. They are reversed. Yes, I'm sorry. Absolutely correct.
Okay, so the 24 years is at 8.5 million, 28 years, 7.75, 24. Okay.
We're looking at a PDF version. I reverse it real quick online, but I cannot do that.
It was a whoops.
It is a whoops. It is, absolutely. And
it was a test.
Several times.
I kind of looked at that and go, wait a minute, but I didn't see it.
Yes, and I added the dates last minute, but I did not add those last minute.
Okay, thank you.
No, you're absolutely correct. I apologize for that.
No, that's...
And actually, we could pause here for a moment. I did request this presentation. I appreciate our taking the time for this. That's exactly the question is, I wanted to make sure that we did not skip the step here. And at a certain point, there was a vote last year, April, May, or whenever it was, that we decided that we, on certain parameters as a board, and those parameters were 24 years, $7.5 million, if I remember. I rewatched the document, $110 million. And what we're finding now is, as illustrated in this document, that version is not actually a $7.5 million version. That's an $8.5 million version. So I guess my question is, given that that was an official act, that was a vote by the board that established those parameters, I'd like to make sure that, again, with this idea of transparency and of understanding how a group like this makes a decision and how individual board members think. Could you speak to that? How did that number end up changing, and what are the considerations that we should be thinking about in terms of essentially taking a vote on one number and then coming back and saying, okay, now we've got to look at a different number. So does that make sense?
Sure, Mr. Kramer. I don't think the board ever took an action on a debt service strategy. There was multiple presentations that were provided over the course of the last 15 months since we brought Breslin Architects on board. Actually, we hadn't brought forward an estimate and showed the analysis of that. The highest we went was up to 90 million. So if you review back to our Finance Committee meetings, it was 90. But we have been hearing, regular reports from the architects and from Dewey Engineering, RCM, that has escalated the project. Most significantly is the construction cost, and the size and scope of the buildings has grown significantly. So our original estimates were in the low 90s. We've seen construction, we've seen the buildings grow from the 90,000 square feet to now 105,000 square feet. We've seen costs go from $330 per square foot. Our last estimate came in at $362 per square foot. Those changes, although they seem in the tens of dollars when you're breaking out per square foot, are millions of dollars in construction cost. So it really is all these factors coming into play. To shorten it, to make recommendations, like I said, it's just a matter of the board's tolerance to the duration of debt, and whether it was showed, 5 months, 6 months ago that the debt service over 90 million would take you 27 years to pay that off, and that was within a tolerance level of the board and your constituents, then that is something that the board could vote on. My goal is to deliver information, to give you options, to give you the best information available. The best information we have available right now, based upon estimates that were just calculated by Dewey about 2 weeks ago, is this project is going to come very close to 108 million. So you have about $2 million worth of contingency to work with currently. It is based on interest rates on the current market. Those interest rates ticked up throughout the course of this year, which is costing, this board and this community money in interest. So all those factors are in play. I mean, it really is multiple factors contributing to this. The bottom line is, can you finance it at the current level in the budget, which is the 7.25, which should be the last column? You can. There's nothing wrong with it. If you're asking my professional opinion, it is longer than, and I think if you go back and review videos, I think the question was posed, are you comfortable with the duration? And one of the comments I made is, you're well beyond my comfort level, but it's not my comfort level that is going to be financing us in years 15, 20, 25. And I'm not sure exactly if anybody can look in the crystal ball and see what our capital needs are going to be in 20. I think that you've got the opportunity to lower this duration of debt. And I think that is something that this board has to weigh. And as I mentioned, that's part of this deliberation. I do not take any personal offense, nor do I have a stake in whether it is 24 years or 31 years. But I do think it's in the best interest of this board, not knowing what is coming, to shorten it to the best of their ability.
Well, and one of the obvious options, so the point at which we were discussing these numbers, the options we were weighing were, we're investing in the current buildings, we're refurbishments and renovations, larger buildings, smaller buildings. One of the questions that is obvious, I think, for this body is, are there methodologies for bringing down this total cost? So what you're saying makes absolute sense, and and exactly fits my purpose, which is to make sure that we're discussing with some detail and in public the things that are going into this decision. So the obvious option when you're working with something that turns out to cost more is to say, well, then we need less building. And I think that it is incumbent on us to at least consider those limitations. The other concern, and Mr. Tracy, you and I met, and I appreciated your addressing this rather thoroughly, but the idea that often when you put a shovel in the ground, you'll start looking at budgets that continue to go up, and paying attention to our library project, for example. Everybody, I think, has watched that with some trepidation as that number grew and grew. So between those issues, there is a place where the financial strategies, the fiscal strategies that we've been using have been really solid, right? So there's places where you say we have consistently put money into capital improvement, right? And setting that level is something, but I think, that's an obvious strategy that we've continued to do. The strategy that has said essentially we have continued to pay debt service at the same level, even when debt was retired, which meant that then the subsequent debt after call date debt could then be retired much more quickly. That's very sound fiscal practice, I think. And also the idea that we have raised taxes slightly each year. That makes sense to me, having experienced the version where you don't raise taxes and then have to jump up. In this instance, what we've done is, we have a huge expenditure to make, and it is an investment that I think is very justifiable. One of the reasons that the comfort level for a longer duration is there is that, in essence, the buildings that we're replacing are buildings with a useful life, buildings that really are on a depreciation schedule almost because of the way they're constructed and their lack of flexibility. The buildings that we're going to put in place are essentially investments. These are buildings that will be assets and will continue to, those are assets that are going to appreciate in essence, because like our other buildings, they can be renovated, they're flexible, they have room where you can run the cabling, you can get to the plumbing, that kind of stuff. So that's a really sound practice as well, to say we are replacing depreciating assets with appreciating assets. Anytime you can do that, you're really doing a service for the future, and that's why that longer term makes sense to me. But in this instance, what we're finding is that there's a strain that has to be put on the budget for many years to come, which we had all discussed and said we want to stay away from that. And so putting that strain on at whatever level it is, and it looks like, that could be, from 7.25 to 8.5 is more than $1 million. That's, a $500,000, I think, at current rates. So that's a lot of stress to put on a budget for a long time. And I want to make sure that we have the discussion that says, what are our other options besides funding these? So can you speak to that?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the key factors will be, right now it's more of a reservation within our budget, because we won't be paying debt service for either of the two large issues this current year, even within next budget year. We can hold tight this pattern and see what happens on bid day. That is going to be a critical milestone to see what the bids look like on our first building, because Greenwood, even though it will come out 8 months later, many of the internal spaces replicate each other. So if we get great numbers in November, December of 2023, that'll give us a better picture of what we're looking at. As we did it in our discussion, we talked about having some safety valve where we're going to be able to look at some core spaces within that budget to actually minimize on bid day, and their deducts built in. So we may lose a small group instruction room. We may lose 2 small group instruction rooms. We may have to go with a lesser tile, not terrazzo tile, but VCT tile. We're going to have some options to lower it. Do I believe it will make a material difference, meaning 10 million? No. This is to really get us under that Act 34. To change the project scope significantly, you would really need to take a step back and revisit the educational specifications and make some really tough decisions. Do we need the multi-purpose room, which is driving a significant cost factor for this? Do we need to look at having enough capacity to handle kindergarten if a decision is made to put kindergarten back? Because that's 5 additional classrooms, plus makes the core spaces bigger. So there are the big decisions. If you're really talking about going from 110 million down to 90, you really have to make some tough decisions, which goes back and will somewhat contradict the educational specifications that was approved by the board.
Right, and that's, we'll say that going back to when we first looked at the project and we were thinking about 90 million, that was prior to construction costs going up, interest rates growing up. But one of the other parameters we put in place was we did not want to have a combined gymnasium and cafeteria. And in order to separate those spaces, when Act 34 came in, it said we needed to add classrooms. We had no control over that. Okay, so now we had to make the building bigger in order to meet one of the other parameters that the board set in place. No more cafegymatoriums. So now we have these extra classrooms you have to put in. What do we utilize it for? Possibly moving kindergarten back in, special instruction. But you start taking classrooms away, we're going to lose that parameter where we don't want to have cafeterias and gymnasiums together. We need to have the parity with Bancroft, because not only do we want the kids educated with the same curriculum in all different schools, we want them to have the same look and feel and education opportunities at all the different schools. It shouldn't matter what neighborhood you live in, what the quality of the building you go to is. And then we came back and revisited for the debt schedule. Yes, we can go with 7.25 million over 31 years, but looking forward to boards that we won't be on, come 10 years from now when the middle school is in need of some renovations, let's say. It's not young. And if we hamper boards to not be able to do a new debt service in 12 years to handle something then, they're not going to look, very well back on us for not thinking that part out. So all of those factors came into how it went from 90 to 110, some of it not due to us because we set a parameter of separating the gyms and cafeterias. That meant classrooms. The interest rate construction's cost. So it was more of looking at, and then yes, you can start cutting down on tiles and things like that, but furnishings and fittings are going to be such a small percentage of the overall project. But certainly they can be looked at. But looking at the length of the debt service is where we have to think, yes, do we keep it at 7.25 million, but now we're hampering someone 10 years down the line, or do we infuse some funds into the debt service to shorten that whole amount? So that's kind of where we got to these conversations.
And thank you both for those thoughts. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think it is incumbent on us as a board to make it clear if we've changed our parameter. There was a vote, right, on this parameter. And I think it is important that we make it clear what our parameter is. I mean, the advice about going into a project is to say, the guidance should be based on the consequences of going beyond a certain level. So the flexibility around the duration of debt is one factor here. I think, the presentation that we spoke to about how to handle the 0.75 or $1.25 million increase, which is above what we had agreed to. We had said we want to stay where we are because it's one of those where, we were going to change one parameter, which was the duration. Nobody was quite comfortable with it, but we made that compromise, and that was good. So what we've now done is say, well, we're actually going to change several, more or less, de facto policies, including, the idea that we are going to not raise taxes to meet this need. That's a place where I think, that's a structural solution to a structural problem. We've also said we're not going to put money into that capital reserve, at least for the first year. And I think we need to clarify that. That's been an ongoing policy. And when that, financial policy changes, I think that's a board question. I think there's also this question of PSERS money coming back and using that to figure out how to use that 0.75 to meet that 0.75 increase that we had not previously wanted to use. That for me is an instance of a place where that until we have a better sense of whether that's a windfall or a structural long-term reality, I think that is a policy that I don't. That's using a windfall to justify something that's a very, very long-term increased pressure on that budget. So I think the place that I come down is if it does seem that it's impossible to reduce the cost of these projects to buy essentially less building, right? If it's impossible to dial back the expense level to the extent that we would have to get closer back to that 7.25 or 7.5 million level, then I think we also need to understand what it is that we're going to do for the long term to ensure that that additional pressure on the budget that we're now handing off for 25 years or 24 years or whatever it is, gets handled structurally. So instead of just saying, well, we're gonna hand you off this additional burden in terms of the things that we can control. We're going to buy this much building and we know it's going to cost every future board an additional $1 million that they're going to have to find. We need to have a discussion now about what that looks like structurally. So if we're creating a structural increase, where's the structural decrease that allows that to happen? Or are we planning to push to raise taxes to meet this need? I mean, I think those discussions are really, really important because right now we don't have an answer to that part. We don't have an answer to say, we are now putting an additional $1 million. And we are not, this is a district that's done very well at keeping a consistent policy going, but, frankly, we've outsourced paraprofessionals, this is not a flush, we are not paying for everything we want to. We are still making sure that we practice austerity in a certain sense, which we need to do. So if we say we're putting another $1 million on everybody for the conceivable future, there needs to be a discussion about how we also offset that and what that means. So I think there are decisions that are linked together, and I think if we get into the thick of things where we've gone so far into the project that we can't dial back in any direction, and suddenly we're caught by the tail, that's a place where we're not exercising the kind of oversight and control, and frankly, we can put ourselves in a position where we are then saddling future generations with a debt burden that prevents them from doing some of the things that they need to do. I think to the point that we don't want to put too much debt for too long, yes, that's one thing, but we also don't want to disturb the budget for the conceivable future. Thanks.
Question for you, Mark. You discussed that the bonds, the first call date would be in 10 years. Does that mean that whatever number we set for debt service will be in play, will be unchangeable for the first 10 years, essentially?
Yes, with each issue that's actually then approved, you subsequently already approved the borrowing of all of the money. You did a parameters resolution, which allows us to go borrow. But yes, at the end of that third issuance, when we actually sign off on that, you will be locked in from that date, 10 years on that issue. You'll be 9 years into the one you're going to issue this year, and 8 into the one that we issued last year.
Which is the 10 million, so it's a smaller amount.
Right.
But yeah, okay.
That's right.
So in the opportunity to refinance and thus change the payment structure occurs at a call date.
Yes, and one of the things you have to really look at is that because it is such a flat yield curve right now, the opportunity to refinance is going to be smaller. I mean, it just is. If we were borrowing it when interest rates were escalating and you were paying interest rates of 6, 7, and 8, and for the last 10 years it's been 2, 3, no different than I always break it down to hopefully a language everybody understands. The residential housing market, you had a lot of refinancing going on years ago, a lot less today. And if the interest rates creep up a little bit, a lot less. So that's the same thing that happens to our bonds. Our short-term rates on the first bond issue are about 3.35%. They escalate to about 4.6. That is going to be hard to capitalize. Now, when we're out to 10 years, at 4%, you might be able to save. But I mean, you're really still looking at refinancing a significant dollar value, and we have issuance costs just like you do when you refinance. So that's all has to be absorbed into that savings that all of our printing, legal expenses, SEC filings, rating, and the underwriter's fee all have to cover that and beyond to make that feasible.
Thank you. I'm sensitive to the balance of concerns. I would preface this by saying this is clearly a finance committee question, but it's clearly a question that needs to be addressed by the 9 members of the board. We can't have a full discussion here in this forum with only 4 elected board members here. But clearly, we did ask for a separate gymnasium and cafeteria. Clearly, we are hoping for a manageable duration. Clearly, we don't want to impact successor boards in a number of years in a way that makes their ability to manage the district more difficult than it needs to be. Clearly, costs are increasing, and we need to find a way to put all of that together and come up with a solution that works for the district in 2023 and 2024 and in 2044 and 2054. So I look forward to those conversations, and that's really all I feel I can or should say at this point.
So Mark, what's that dropped, at what point do we have to actually determine the number of years of debt we're going to get into? At what point do we need to make that final decision? Is it for this year's budget? Is it for next year's budget?
Well, I mean, I would say that part of it resides in this year's budget. I mean, one of the things that we're going to do is actually stage that debt, be prepared to issue that debt this year. But you'll have as late as November of this year really start making some final determinations, because we typically give the approvals about 60 days in advance of the issuance of the bonds. There's marketing that goes on, there's marking the market, so there's all those things that will occur prior to actually issuing that debt. So, the luxury that we had in this year's debt is that they did lower, as Mr. Craig pointed out, the PSERS rate. So our retirement rate went down, we capitalized on that. That money, could either be used to offset other programmatic costs, it could be used to lower the millage proposed increase. Same thing happened with our interest revenue. It spiked almost $800,000 for next year. So although we're feeling that pressure on the bonds from that increased interest rate, we have a nice offset of almost a $800,000 revenue source through our investment strategy. So, one could argue, I could argue that that's a great offset of use of funds. We're getting a revenue source that was unanticipated coming in, as long as interest rates stay up, and we can utilize that to offset higher interest rates on the coupons of our bonds. I would like to see at least some decision making so that we can plan out the next two, but when you're asking, we have it in this year's budget. Actually, this committee recommended the inclusion of both the PSERS and the capital reserve contribution be lumped into the debt service. So when you see the proposed final budget, barring any action, to reverse that, it's not 8.5, it's a little bit short of that, but we're working to move that up to 8.5 will reflect the short 24-year duration of bonds. Then you'll have another 2 months to make some decisions as a board as to how we move that. We can certainly have many more discussions about all these aspects of it, to talk about the scope of the project, to talk about what's in, what's out, and the duration of the bonds. But really until November of next year, when you issue that second issuance of $50 million, at that point in time, I'm going to need to know, to give direction to our financial advisors, to either look at stretching it out over 30 years or over 24 years.
And when are we going to get our first run on the construction costs again?
Right about that time. I mean, we'll have another estimate coming in the fall, but our bids are due in right at the end of November.
Okay.
And Mark, I'd asked you this before, and I think you were going to look it up, you weren't quite sure, but what was the length of our debt issuance for Bancroft and the middle school? What's our typical length of debt?
I want to go to the last slide in the deck.
Next slide.
Since I can't look at that error in my other spreadsheets. All right, the middle school, going back, I was hired in 2001, and we really were still issuing debt for the middle school coming in. This district has always enjoyed a very low, or very short, should I say, debt service schedule. So for the middle school, you can see that we have a total of $48 million. And, to address some of what I'm sure is going to be specific, why? Why was the middle school, we did our debt there 19 years, for Bancroft 15. It's simple. You're building two schools simultaneously.
Right.
If we built one school today and waited 10 years, as we did with Bancroft, and built a second new school in 10 years, your debt durations would be significantly less.
Yeah.
It's that we need the capital today, and that is causing a much larger debt service obligation. So when we did the middle school, we only had the middle school. The middle school is a very complex, and I'm going to be the first one to say that this is not an apples to apples comparison. The middle school had no less than 8 different bond issues. There was interim financing. There was Emmaus bond pools, which are money we borrow from authorities that pay a weekly interest rate, and then you refund them when it's a good time in the market. So the middle school had some very complex financing strategies, but that is the basic nutshell that was followed with PlanCon as our final cost. And, it's pretty easy to take a look at that. Bancroft was much simpler, with the exception of Bancroft, we took advantage of Build America bonds in 2010, which gave us a 30% discount on interest, trying to stimulate the economy back in 2010. So we were getting 30%, then it dropped midway through to about 27%. But that had a very advantageous yield on those bonds through the Build America bonds. But really, that is the significant difference. I mean, when you really look at it, 19 years for the middle school, Bancroft was 15. The high school really mirrored the middle school, multiple issues, but a very short duration for debt. Actually, that is what we're really paying off between that and Bancroft. There was some refinancing. But it is just that you're borrowing really almost 3 times as much as the middle school.
You are, but if we were to do those projects sequentially, I'm pretty safe in saying that the construction costs would go up higher than the savings on the duration of the bonds. I think we'd wind up paying a lot more if we waited on one of the schools, not to mention the disruption of moving kids back and forth and everything else, but it goes on both ends. So there's an advantage of doing it both at the same time, and there's a debt duration disadvantage of doing it both at the same time. But I think that the advantages are more than the disadvantages.
Yes, and I think my point being for the 110, 30 years, if you did them back to back, even if you did them 10 years apart, you had a 15-year to 15-year, you're still going to end up at the 30. It'd be more expensive then, yes.
Well, and I think the question of then, what those options are. So when you bring up that option of delaying, I think there is a place where we as a board need to say, okay, here are the things that we now have rejected. We've said we're not going to do the following options. I think one of the things that makes it's pretty clear is that these buildings have been built larger in part to absorb a kindergarten. And so that may be something that we need to make.
That was not where we were going. When we were talking about it, we were talking about, first of all, following the guidelines the state had, and we were looking at having a separate multi-gym, the kindergarten was not even talked about. I mean, that's beginning to crawl into the discussion now.
It was just mentioned by
part of
Mr.
the
Tracy.
discussion. It was not.
No,
Our decision was primarily
we had
around.
to, Act 34 said we had to add classroom space in order to balance out the non-instructional space of the gym. And what do we want to do with those classrooms? An option that was brought up was maybe we'll bring kindergarten back in. Maybe we do other things. It was not an opening parameter.
Understood. So, but I think the issue of making the decision. So when we said we've made the decision, the vote that we've taken so far was at a particular level of parameter. There also is, there's some complications, and I'm going to follow this as best I can, but there are complications in that the legislature has talked about funding school buildings, and that's something that apparently is very hot right now. If that were to ever happen, that also then would argue, and it's hard to tell, right, whether that's happening or not, but that also would say, would argue that delaying does make a lot of sense. So I think the underlying issue is exactly what Mr. Cronenberg said, which is that the discussion of we want to be able to talk as 9 people and make sure that we are getting the best version of this. We have to make sure that we're digging in and not sort of skipping the steps that are about making these decisions as best we can. So I defer to Mr. Cronenberg's thought on that and look forward as he does to having that discussion.
Which is why we don't vote on anything at committee meetings.
Right. I think if anything, we need to encourage our colleagues to be here at the next finance meeting so we can have a discussion. But I in no way think that it's feasible to delay. I think the biggest decision we have to make is how many years we want to go out on the bond issues. To me, that's where we are. Our decision as a board was to build 2 new schools. That was our decision. We did not decide anything around the financing. This is where we are right now. So as far as I'm concerned, our biggest decision is, what do we want to carry, at 24, at 28, or 31? That's where I think we stand at this point.
I see it the same way. I see it the same way.
So, but I think the key would be to encourage our colleagues to be at our next finance so we can actually then have the conversation as an entire group in the next finance meeting.
Okay, well, that was lively. I think that was longer than you, Dan.
Don't humor him. I'll hear that in the morning.
I hope so, given the dollar.
There were fewer slides, but More discussion. Is there any other further business? You have your light on, Mr. Tracy.
Yeah, one quick item, just to follow up on April's meeting, and we certainly can add this to the agenda. We do have the governor's budget, as I mentioned. Mr. Levitsky will be here from the Chester County Intermediate Unit to present the IU budgets as well. So I just wanted to get that on the radar. So we certainly could.
We can have Joe cut this down.
Yeah. Okay. Seeing no further questions or business, we are adjourned at whatever time that is.